Hello! Before we start, some disclaimers are in order. This video will address Activision's most recent iteration of Call of Duty, that is, Call of Duty Vanguard. But to a very real extent, I will be veering off the path, so to speak, to discuss, in much more depth, the various historical components, myths, ideologies, and perspectives the game draws on. Eventually, we'll even veer off into other historical topics altogether that seemingly have nothing to do with the game, such as the UK race riots of 1919, the Rhineland occupation after World War I, and even French colonial Africa in the 1890s. We'll also explore how academics have typically analyzed these events through a distorted lens, and how modern media, such as Call of Duty Vanguard, have begun to reorient the historical perspective of World War II in order to further a more modern political agenda. Now, these videos do take a lot of time and effort to research, write, edit, and publish. They even cost me money. So if you like and appreciate what I do here, please consider supporting my work on Subscribestar or via crypto donations. Every little bit helps, since at this point I have no way to monetize after being banned from YouTube. See the links in the sticky comments or the video description depending on the platform. Now with that out of the way, let's begin. So, Call of Duty Vanguard takes place at the tail end of World War II and centers on the experience of a super-secret allied coalition force called Vanguard. The group is led by a black man named Arthur Kingsley. The rest of the six-man team is comprised of an adrenaline junkie American pilot, an insubordinate and temperamental Australian serving in the 8th Army, and a Russian nurse who becomes a deadly sniper with superhuman climbing skills straight out of Assassin's Creed. The black man, Arthur Kingsley, is portrayed as the glue holding together this otherwise motley crew as they go behind enemy lines to uncover data on Project Phoenix, a Nazi operation which the Allied command knows little about but believes to be of extreme importance. Long story short, Project Phoenix is the brainchild of a fictional, slightly effeminate Nazi who wants to start a Fourth Reich from the ashes of the Third, hence the name Project Phoenix. Now yes, this is all historical fiction, but it's fairly fantastical. Most Allied service personnel, even the British, who had technically dropped the color bar by this point, had quite the politically incorrect views by today's standards, and the command structure at the time would not have placed a black man in charge of any combat unit, let alone one commanding white troops going behind enemy lines. The Washington Post recently released an article about the topic of racial sentiments held by white service personnel. In it, one American soldier is reported as having said, quote, "I'll never salute a Negro officer and I'll not take orders from a Negro," unquote. The same article goes on to highlight a survey in which 75% of soldiers from the North and 85% of soldiers from the South voiced their feelings that blacks and whites should train and serve separately. Now invariably, some people will focus here on the fact that the British didn't have American-styled segregation and that the colored bar had been dropped. Again, this is true, but it ignores several other considerations we'll get into later. But Activision nevertheless engaged in straightforward revisionism. During a flashback to D-Day, Arthur Kingsley assumes command of British paratroopers during Operation Tunga after their officer is killed. Now, there was technically a black paratrooper in the 6th British Airborne Division who participated in the invasion of France. His name was Sidney Cornell. His father was African American and his mother was British. Cornell was a private and a runner, meaning he relayed messages back and forth between units, which was an extremely dangerous and crucial task. But I'm not sure that grants Activision the liberty to portray Kingsley the way they did. Essentially, Kingsley's white comrades are all about to give up on the mission after they land and discover their commander is dead and see the situation as hopeless. Kingsley rises to the occasion and rallies them to keep going, and in response, they all agree to put him in charge. Now, while I do think mainland Brits would not have been quite as racially biased against blacks as their American counterparts were, I'm also not sure they would have felt comfortable suddenly handing over command to an untested private. Regardless, the real-life Cornell didn't assume command of anything or anyone. He didn't lead troops in an assault against the Maryville gun battery after clearing a path in a minefield by steering a truck into it, and while destroying that battery was important, I don't know if, had it not been destroyed, the invasion would have failed, as Kingsley put it. Ironically, the character Richard Webb, who hands over command to Kingsley at the outset, is based on Terence Otway, the actual British commander who led the assault on the Merivale Battery. Activision not only didn't give Otway any credit with something as simple as a name reference, but they sidelined his fictional counterpart in order to elevate a person of color. Now, Sidney Cornell did in fact receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions as a runner during Normandy, and he was promoted to sergeant. But looking at some other men in his unit, this doesn't appear to be all that exceptional. The 7th Parachute Battalion received many medals for many notable actions. For example, Terence Otway himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and Michael McGee of A Company received the Distinguished Conduct Medal after he, quote, engaged a Panther tank at point-blank range with his Sten gun fired from the hip and caused it to stop at a point when his comrades put it out of action with a hand bomb, unquote. Activision's embellishment of Cornell's fictional counterpart doesn't end here, though. Kingsley speaks fluent German, French, and Russian, and also seems to have an acute medical knowledge. Beyond this, there's a strangely consistent theme of Kingsley needing to prove himself to his white comrades, even though none of them exhibit even the mildest form of racial bias. After the Vanguard Task Force is captured by the Nazis and is being transported in the back of a van, the Aussie gets angry and blames Kingsley for their capture. With an almost reverential tone, Richard Webb begins to reminisce about the time he himself had doubted Kingsley during Operation Tonga. It's strange because, first off, Webb literally put Kingsley in charge right away during Operation Tonga and followed every one of his orders with no hesitation. Second, the scene in the back of the van sort of highlights that, besides Kingsley and Webb, none of these individuals actually know each other, which means the Allies just sort of randomly picked some people and threw them together on a top-secret mission of the utmost importance. But are we really meant to believe that in 1945, a bunch of random men from the Anglosphere would so easily follow the orders of a black man as he led them behind enemy lines with some Russian sniper woman they just met? While we're on that subject, yes, the Russians did have female snipers, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, whom the character Petrova is based on, supposedly had over 300 kills. Now, I don't want to go down a path of completely undermining her entire combat record, but I do think the Soviets had a tendency to lie about these sort of things. For example, the famous duel between Vasily Zaitsev and Erwin Koenig, a supposed top German sniper of the Wehrmacht, probably never happened, since there are no German records of any Erwin Koenig. Activision has an entire mission wherein Petrova duels and kills a top German sniper in Stalingrad. This is interesting because while the actual Battle of Stalingrad was taking place, Pavlichenko was on a literal propaganda mission to the United States to convince them to invade Germany from the west. Supposedly, Pavlichenko's purported 309 kills were all acquired entirely between August of 1941 and July of 1942, most being acquired during the battle for Sevastopol. Now, according to sources cited by Russian author Lyuba Vinogradova, Pavlichenko's own father was a member of the NKVD, that is, the Soviet secret police. Indeed, Vinogradova has a very interesting chapter about Pavlichenko in her book, Avenging Angels. She outlines various discrepancies about the related myths. I'll read one section at length here. Quote, "What are we to make of the tale she told of how she regarded the 300th German she had killed as a birthday present to herself? Lyudmila Pavlichenko's birthday was on July 12th, but Sevastopol had already been captured by the Germans at the end of June, and even the main Soviet news agency, the Inform Bureau, admitted the city's fall in its bulletin on July 3rd. According to Soviet sources, Pavlichenko was evacuated with serious injuries, but no wounded soldiers were evacuated from Sevastopol after mid-June. Pavlichenko herself in her memoirs, published for some reason only in 2015, mentions that she was evacuated on June 22, 1945. Even if she and her biographers have got the date of her injury and evacuation wrong, and she did indeed give herself a birthday present of her 300th enemy soldier on July 12th, when did she find the time to kill another 9? If we are to believe Pavlichenko's account, German propagandists shouted through a loudspeaker that they would cut her into 309 pieces. She must logically have remained at the front long enough after her birthday for the Germans to have discovered her tally. But where was this all taking place if Sevastopol had long since fallen?" Unquote. Later in the chapter, Vinogradova shares a story about how a German sniper supposedly employed cats and dogs standing on their hind legs as a means to distract young Pavlichenko, which does seem utterly fantastical. Vinogradova also cites the work of a Russian historian, Oleg Kaminsky, who undertook the first serious research into the veracity of the tales of the so-called super sniper. Quote, "He found some oddities in the stories of her earliest days at the front. Pavlichenko's account of the fighting in Odessa describes a completely different district from the one in which, according to the documents, her regiment was fighting. Lyudmila Pavlichenko claims that General Ivan Petrov personally ordered her to select and lead a platoon of snipers. In 1941 and 1942, however, the Red Army did not yet have any sniper platoons. Moreover, by the time Pavlichenko's frontline career was over, she held the rank only of sergeant major, which would have precluded commanding anything larger than a squad. Pavlichenko also told the tale of how the Germans once sent in a whole platoon of their snipers to take on her platoon, and how a duel ensued between the Soviet and German snipers. This is implausible. The Germans at the time also had only lone snipers, and not many of those. There could be no question of whole platoons of them." Unquote. We could continue here, but let's not. Let's return to the topic of POCs in the British military and how non-white people were generally perceived in Great Britain at the time, and let's compare it with Activision's rendition. In 1984, historian David Reynolds wrote a paper which is highly informative here. Although the British government officially didn't have a segregation policy, in 1942, when details about America's deployment of troops to the British Isles were being discussed, the British government actually worked to keep black troops out of Britain entirely. Quote, "In 1942, the government expressed discreet but firm opposition to U.S. plans to send black troops to Britain. The British Chiefs of Staff told Washington in April that they did not favor the use of colored troops, but although supported by the U.S. Army Command in Britain, their preferences were overruled by the U.S. War Department." Unquote. Ultimately, black and white units in England were granted access to different towns on different days, and recreational events were held on different nights for different units. Yes, the Home Office and other entities instructed British officials not to enforce American policies directly, but this was likely due to imperial political concerns. The British authorities didn't wish to upset the colored personnel they had recruited from the Empire, or cause unrest in their colonies at a time when they needed to draw on their resources. One War Cabinet memo stated the following, quote, "But although it has been ruled that for the period of the present emergency, colored British subjects in this country are to be on the same footing as British subjects of pure European descent, as regards the grant of emergency commissions and entry into the armed forces, for obvious reasons, it is not desired to encourage colored British subjects to come to this country for direct enlistment in the imperial forces. The difficulty of according different treatment to white and colored volunteers in the same colony will be readily appreciated. It is hoped to meet this difficulty to some extent by providing openings for colored persons in locally raised units." Unquote. The same memo goes on to highlight that black West Indians, quote, "would be of doubtful military value for combat service overseas, especially against German troops in Europe." Unquote. Indeed, it was common knowledge at the time that during the Great War, colored colonial units had fared poorly in European winter conditions. The French had even employed a practice called hivernage, wherein blacks would be redeployed to the south during the harshest months. As an aside, hivernage was implemented at the insistence of a black activist, Blaise Diagne. Indeed, modern studies do seem to support the idea that black people receive more cold weather-related injuries than do whites. One U.S. Army study from 2003 revealed that the rate was 4 times higher for blacks than it was for whites. Curiously, it is a fairly regular occurrence for black men to sue the British Ministry of Defense after suffering cold weather-related injuries. For example, as recent as 2022, Bernard Iegudu sued the ministry for over £1.5 million after he suffered from trench foot. He told the High Court that, as a man of black African ethnicity, he would have been at greater risk than others, and the military should have given him special considerations. But getting back on track regarding David Reynolds' paper, Britain's stance on race during World War II was more or less consistent with their history. During World War I, the British government, quote, "had avoided using West Indian troops in combat except against non-whites in the Middle East, and they were mostly employed in labor battalions. Indian troops were, however, used in action in France, but care was taken to minimize their contact with white women and to keep them out of Britain." Similar policies were adopted at the beginning of World War II. Although black pressure groups forced the government to announce in October 1939 that British citizens, not of pure European descent, could volunteer for the armed forces and be considered for commissions on the same basis as whites, this was only a temporary measure during the present emergency, and in practice, the cabinet intended that black volunteers should be mainly used in labor units in their home territories, unquote. The thing to remember here is that Britain didn't have a segregation policy because there was really no need for one. As David Reynolds notes, in 1939, there were no more than 7,000 or 8,000 blacks living in Britain. That's 7,000 or 8,000 out of about 47 million citizens, the overwhelming majority of whom were white, and the British government had every intention of keeping it this way. Reynolds indicates that although the British government relaxed some of its non-white restrictions on recruitment, this ultimately had zero effect on their desire to keep Britain white. Quote, as one Foreign Office official recorded in January 1942 after interdepartmental consultation, it became evident that during discussions on the subject of overseas manpower, the recruitment to the United Kingdom of colored British subjects, whose remaining in the United Kingdom after the war might create a social problem, was not considered desirable. This, he said, was the accepted view in Whitehall, unquote. Now is the point where we're going to get into the UK race riots of 1919 in order to better illustrate what the British authorities meant here by social problems. To a large extent, they had already experienced them after World War I and wished to avoid them again. During World War I, several thousand colored men were hired to fill the vacant positions of British men who had gone off to fight. Some were Middle Easterns, some were West African, others were technically from the West Indies, but racially that just meant West African. Most were from British territories, although some were from Portuguese and French colonies as well. The overwhelming majority were males, and most had no established roots in the UK. But during the course of the war, they gradually began to form their own tiny colonies and communities in various port cities, mainly Liverpool and Cardiff. All in all, the total population of these non-white foreigners may have amounted to about 10,000. Many had been engaged in maritime and dock work centered around shipping. Others had served in the Imperial Navy and, after the war, were demobilized in Britain. As a quick aside, the argument here that this latter fact should somehow entitle them all to stay and live in Britain is about as silly as the idea that all Canadians and Australians should have been allowed to stay and live in Britain since they too were British subjects and had served the Empire. In any case, at the war's end, many British men came home only to find they now had to compete for jobs and housing with thousands of foreigners who had taken up residence in their port towns. Often these foreigners would work for lower wages because they were overwhelmingly single and had no families to support. Now yes, some had married local white girls and started families, but as we'll explore, many of the interactions with local females was of a dubious nature. Unsurprisingly, all this gave rise to interracial strife. Tensions culminated with a series of riots in the summer of 1919. To the extent that these riots have been covered, mainstream historians and media outlets, such as the BBC, have cultivated a very one-sided narrative in which blacks are seen as the absolute unquestionable victims of irrational nativist racism. The victim, most often brought up, is Charles Wooten, a 24-year-old Bermudan who is portrayed as an innocent bystander, chased into the Liverpool docks and drowned by a mob of thousands of angry white men. Then afterwards, the police and court system are seen as having covered it all up. As usual though, there's more to the story that is conveniently omitted. The Friday, June 6th issue of the Manchester Evening News explains the initial sequence of events. Quote, about 9:30 last evening, a number of Danes were leaving a public house in the neighborhood of Great George's Square when one of them was attacked by several Negroes and badly stabbed. A constable on duty interfered, whereupon he was assaulted, the Negroes using razors and knives and cutting his face and back in terrible fashion. After battling courageously with his assailants, the officer sank exhausted to the ground. Then somebody summoned assistance, and the police came in force from Argyle Street Station. In the meantime, the Negroes had fled from the scene and gone to their headquarters in Upper Pitt Street, where they are to be found in abundance, unquote. As the newspapers tell us, the police pursued these men to a lodging house in Upper Pitt Street. When the police entered the house, they were fired upon with revolvers. 4 of them were seriously wounded. One was shot in the mouth and the bullet exited the back of his neck and struck the policeman behind him. Another was badly slashed across the face with a razor. Now, Charles Wooten was without any doubt present in this building, and he fled when the police tried to apprehend him. The Manchester Evening News even tells us that Wooten may have fired on the police himself when he fled, and that this is what incensed the crowd. Now, as far as what happened next, the details are hard to ascertain with absolute certainty because the various sources all report slightly different versions. But a crowd of angry people did form and pursued Wooten as he fled the scene down to the docks, where the police eventually caught him. The Leeds Mercury reports the following, quote, "Whether he jumped, was swept, or was thrown into the water, witnesses were unable to say, but subsequently he was seen swimming about, and the crowd threw things at him. Suddenly he disappeared, in spite of all efforts made to save him. His body was recovered nearly an hour later," unquote. Now, without much doubt, I think we can safely say there was some factor of vigilantism that occurred. A lot of the papers at the time do report that a Negro was drowned by a mob. The Globe even says there was one report in which the crowd threw bricks at Wooten. The Liverpool Echo states that Wooten was wrenched from police custody on the docks by the crowd, but that he then escaped and dove into the water himself. It then says, quote, that a detective climbed down a ship's rope and was about to pull the man out of the water when a stone thrown from the middle of the crowd struck Wooten on the head and he sank, unquote. Now, clearly, there was some extent of vigilantism here, but ultimately at the inquiry, the authorities and a jury felt there was insufficient evidence to determine how exactly Wooten ended up in the water and drowned. Historians often make a big fuss over the fact that no one was charged with Wooten's murder. But as far as I know, no one was charged either with the murder of 20-year-old shoesmith Harold Smart, who on June 11th walked up to a police constable and asked for help after a black man had slit his throat in the street with a razor. Several witnesses testified as to the presence of blacks assaulting Smart and others, but eventually they fled the scene and were never caught by the police. Of course, none of this justifies the extrajudicial killing of Charles Wooten. If Wooten was intentionally killed by the mob, then he didn't get a fair trial. But let's consider here that today, pretty much everyone feels that after a white person calls a black person a bad name, any violent response thereafter is seen, if not justified, at least expected. People generally offer no sympathy and will often say, well, he should have seen that coming. Take, for example, the film Die Hard 3, wherein the character John McClane goes into a black neighborhood wearing a sign saying, "I hate niggers." The audience readily understands that blacks are going to respond quite passionately to such an instigation. Yet, when we examine the local reaction to Wooten's behavior on June 5, 1919, virtually no one will say, well, Wooten should have seen that coming. Blacks had literally assaulted, stabbed, and shot both civilians and policemen. And yet, in historical retrospection, we become outraged that the white people involved didn't exercise greater restraint than the blacks. Now, beyond that consideration, of the 5 people killed during the 1919 race riots, 3 were white: John Donovan, the aforementioned Harold Smart, and Frederick Henry Longman. Wooten was actually the only black man killed. The other non-white was an Arab. Let's examine the deaths of the white men, starting with Harold Smart. According to the Western Mail, on Tuesday, July 1st, 1919, quote, Police Constable Thomas Davies deposed that at 10:20 p.m. on June 11th, he was on duty in the Hayes. He saw a crowd of people at the end of Caroline Street nearest the Hayes Bridge. At 10:35 p.m., he saw the deceased man Smart coming towards him with his hands to his throat. "A nigger has cut my throat," he told the officer, who immediately put him in a taxicab and took him to King Edward VII Hospital. Subsequently, he endeavored, without success, to find out who had inflicted the injury. The next witness, Patrick Linehan of 11 Mill Lane, stated that he saw a black man and a young fellow arguing the toss, and a white girl was standing by. 5 or 10 seconds after, witness saw the nigger turn around and he seemed to strike the white man across the face. As his hand came away, witness noticed that it contained a razor. Witness immediately rushed at the black man, called him a dirty black blank, and struck him on the side of the face. The black man fell, and witness called upon 2 white men to hold him down while he, witness, attended to the injured man. A few minutes later, he turned around and found that the black man had vanished in the direction of Caroline Street. Witness thought he would be able to identify the black assailant again, unquote. The July 1st issue of the South Wales News also reported on the local inquiry into Harold Smart's death. Quote, Bert Lewis deposed that he was with the deceased when 7 or 8 colored men came running towards them, and one said, "If any of you white blank Want to fight? Come on." Witness ran away, and on looking back when 15 yards away, saw Smart on the ground with one colored man on top of him and another bending over him. The colored men appeared to be ill-treating deceased. On the advice of the coroner, the jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, unquote. Now, regarding John Donovan, the South Wales News stated the following on June 14th, quote, "John Donovan, who was shot in Millicent Street and who died on Thursday night after admission to the King Edward Hospital, was a single man about 28 years of age. He was a Cardiff man and was the son of Mr. John Donovan, boilermaker, who at one time lived at 45 Mary Ann Street, where the victim of Thursday night's affair was born. He was formerly well known in Cardiff as a footballer and runner and won several cups and other prizes on the track. He was a boilermaker prior to the war, but for some time past had been serving as a driver in the Royal Field Artillery, from which he was only a few weeks ago demobilized. Since his return from the war, Donovan had been working for the Taff Val Railway Company and had lived of late in Grangetown, where a sister lives. He was engaged to be married to a girl in the Mary Ann Street area, and the banns had been put up. One or two residents of Mary Ann Street were chatting with Donovan about 10 o'clock on Thursday night about the black men, and Donovan said, 'If there's any trouble up here tonight, I'll come and help you to protect your house.' Almost immediately Donovan had said this, there was a rush of the crowd to Millicent Street, and Donovan went off in that direction. It wasn't 10 minutes after that," added the Mary Ann Street resident, "that news was brought that poor Donovan had been shot and that they believed he was dead. The deceased served for over 4 years in France," unquote. As to why the white crowd had formed, several newspapers reported that a Somali man had threatened a white woman. The crowd pursued the Somali to a local boarding house where several black men resided. Without a doubt, the blacks inside fired on the crowd with revolvers, killing John Donovan in the process. The white crowd retaliated then by throwing stones and ginger beer bottles. When the police entered the premises, they were also shot at, but were not hit, though not for lack of trying. One constable's helmet was struck. If you read through enough of these accounts, a pattern begins to emerge, revealing ample evidence that blacks and Arabs at the time were much more heavily armed than whites, and much more predisposed to firing freely into unarmed crowds and using razors in what were otherwise low-intensity fistfights. Various newspapers commented on this. The Taunton Courier said the following, quote, "The fact that the Negroes are nearly all armed and fire on the slightest provocation intensifies the swiftness with which isolated encounters swell into street battles," unquote. The Globe said, quote, "It has been proved during the recent riots that most lower caste colored men in England go about armed and are ready to loose off on the slightest provocation. A regulation might easily be enforced, making it illegal for a colored man to carry any arms, and a heavy penalty should be inflicted for any breach of the order," unquote. Consider here as well that at the end of May, a black man was arrested in the Liverpool docks after he slashed several white people with a razor, including a woman. He even bit a man's finger who tried to restrain him. All throughout 1919, black men repeatedly attacked individuals and police officers with razors and revolvers. This repeated behavioral pattern probably helped instigate white mobs, who curiously don't appear to have resorted to stabbing or shooting any of their victims. Now, moving on to Frederick Longman, the Yorkshire Post tells us about his murder. Quote, "Longman, who was about 30 years of age and had only recently been demobilized after serving 4.5 years in the RFA, was, it appears, returning home at about 10 o'clock on Wednesday night. He had almost got to his own door when two colored men sprang on him. A struggle ensued, and one of the colored men is stated to have caught Longman by the throat, held him against the wall, and, taking a long knife out of his pocket, stabbed him with it," unquote. Now, at the inquest, a black female witness, Louisa Richards, who was a friend of Emmanuel, claimed that Longman approached Emmanuel and told him to go find his own street to walk in, and then began hitting him in the face. Another witness, Elsie Rudman, stated that Longman was on his front door stoop when they exchanged greetings. She had gone no farther than 10 yards when she heard a scuffle behind her. She turned around and saw that Emmanuel had pinned Longman against the wall and was choking him. In response, Rudman screamed. This alerted two white men nearby, who came to Longman's aid. Now, this is where the witnesses' accounts start to seriously conflict, but essentially, the two white men got Emmanuel to let go of Longman, and then Emmanuel pulled out a knife, stabbed Longman, and then ran off. Per the Western Mail on June 21st, the black witnesses claimed that Longman had made a final lunge toward Emanuel, which is what prompted Emanuel to stab Longman. Charles Emanuel said the following in his defense at trial, quote, "I defend myself with a pocket knife. I was coming down the street for a little walk after signing on, and this man said, 'Why don't you go in your own street?' I say, 'Behave yourself.' By the time I turn around to him, I speak to one colored woman and he came behind me and hit me one clout in the eye. 3 more hit me, one with poker, and I defend myself with knife. I run away shouting murder," unquote. As an aside, Emanuel was from the French West Indies, hence his poor English, but the Western Mail states the following details concerning the testimony of the 2 white men involved, James Yeoman and John Hopkins. Now, in the interest of clarity, I've replaced some of the pronouns and other terms like witness and prisoner with surnames. Quote, "James Yeoman, a painter, deposed to hearing a woman scream and seeing Emanuel holding Longman by the throat against a wall. Yeoman rushed up and said to Emanuel, 'Why don't you leave him alone?' Yeoman then struck Emanuel a blow on the face, and Emanuel then let go of Longman and took a knife out of his pockets, with which he attempted to strike Yeoman and Hopkins. Failing to do this, Emanuel stabbed Longman, who was standing in the roadway in a dazed condition. Emanuel then ran off, and Hopkins, fetching a poker, threw it after him, striking Emanuel on the back. Mr. Marley Sampson, is it true that Longman made a rush at Emanuel? No, sir. In cross-examination by Mr. Hugh Jones, Yeoman would not admit that Longman, after being let go, followed Emanuel into the roadway. John Charles Hopkins of Lee Road, Barry, a ship's painter, gave corroborative evidence and said that Longman, as far as he was aware, did nothing to the accused at the time he was stabbed," unquote. Essentially, the white witnesses claimed that Emanuel tried to stab them after they were able to free Longman, and that after he failed to stab them, he stabbed Longman, who was in a dazed state, and then he ran off. In other words, Emanuel really wasn't acting in self-defense since Longman wasn't a clear and present danger to him. Ultimately, a jury found Charles Emanuel guilty of manslaughter, which I think was an appropriate verdict. Emanuel's life was not in danger, and even if the other 2 men had attacked him first with a poker, the fact is he stabbed Longman, who was unarmed. He probably could have run off to the police at several points prior, since he himself was never restrained by the witnesses or the deceased, yet he only ran off after he stabbed Longman. Now, while the verdict did seem appropriate, the sentence did not. A judge gave him a mere 5 years in prison, so how's that for racism? Again, something you will notice about the leftist-oriented academic literature on these riots is a particular tendency. When more blacks than whites were arrested, prosecuted, and/or received harsher sentences, the literature repeatedly accuses the local courts and police of racial bias. And when those same courts and police acquit or lessen the guilt of blacks, this is taken as unquestionable truth. Jacqueline Jenkinson, in her 1987 thesis for the University of Edinburgh, notes that Charles Emanuel's sentence was, quote, "the most severe sentence handed out to anyone as a direct result of the race rioting in 1919, unquote. All things considered though, if we were able to subtract race from this equation, I think most people would find such a sentence quite lenient. Yet Jenkinson uses it to argue that the courts were racist because no white person got such a sentence. But the thing is, there really wasn't a corresponding case at the time that matched all the particular circumstances wherein the races were reversed, so I'm not really sure Jenkinson has a point. Now, she does highlight a separate case wherein a white man named John Flynn Martin was charged with kicking a police constable and threatening him with a knife, and that he only received 1 month in prison, whereas an Arab named Mohammed Abouki was charged with attacking a police constable with a stick, yet received 6 months in prison. Now, even were this particular case a definitive example of racial bias, Jenkinson is still applying a general stereotype to white people, and assuming that because there was racial bias in the Martin Abouki case, there had to have been bias in the Longman Emanuel case. In other words, anti-racists typically swap one set of racial biases in favor of another set in their attempt to escape quote-unquote racism. All throughout her coverage of the Longman murder, Jenkinson goes to great lengths to defend Charles Emanuel. She highlights that prior to Longman's deployment overseas, he had 20 convictions in the local court system for summary offenses, which is notable, but these were very minor offenses, meaning they never required a jury trial. Moreover, such a past hardly indicated that Longman had intended to murder Charles Emanuel. Beyond this, the local police also stated that they had a history with Charles Emanuel, though they never explicitly qualify what kind of history it was. With this in mind, Jenkinson also takes issue with the fact that a local newspaper took into account the general black disposition toward violence, or at least that's how she frames it. In the June 13th issue of the Barrie Dock News, they mentioned that Charles Emanuel had recently arrived from Manchester, where he had been a witness in another murder trial. Quote, "The alleged murderer came from Manchester a fortnight ago, having given evidence at assizes thereat in a stabbing case from Barrow and Furness, in which a number of colored men were concerned." Unquote. Jenkinson sees this as the paper smearing the black community and thereby the individual Charles Emanuel, and she shares the details of that particular murder. Apparently, it wasn't even a stabbing, but an instance in which a Jamaican shot a West African in the head in a personal dispute on board a ship. Jenkinson says that this case, quote, "was hardly proof of an innate tendency to violence among black people in general. Rather, it was the story of a victim standing up to a recognized bully with a gun, it is true, but without any proved intent to murder." Yet by economizing with the truth, the local South Wales press report implied that Emanuel and black people in general were prone to violence, unquote. So Jenkinson can clearly see a pattern of racial bias in white people, but not a pattern of violent behavior in blacks. Or more precisely, I suppose, she can entertain patterns of negatively perceived behavior in white people, but not in black people.
People ran for cover through smoke-filled mayhem. Sounds of gunfire, the crowd targeting police.
Shots fired, shots fired. An injured officer here.
The gun at the scene that we are recovering was stolen in a burglary along with 500 rounds of ammunition.
It's not going to end today. I can't tell you it's going to end tomorrow. I don't know when it's going to end. But it's for y'all to start. We're not the ones that's killing us. Y'all killing us.
But Jenkinson goes somewhat further. She even highlights Frederick Longman and his criminal record as, quote, "an archetype for the white mobs during the riots," unquote. Note that Jenkinson posits elsewhere, as do many other academics, that much of the white mob violence stemmed from white men's sexual jealousy of black men. This is amusing because Frederick Longman was married to the same woman for 18 years and had 3 kids. Not exactly the archetype of a post-war incel. Neither was John Donovan, for that matter, who, as you'll recall, was engaged to be married before he was killed. But again, what's notable about the leftist literature on these events is how when the historical material presents a negative depiction of blacks, it's taken as evidence of racism. But when the same material presents a positive image of blacks, it's seen as unquestionably accurate. The court system, police reports, and newspapers are all seen through this lens. Take, for example, what Jenkinson says about the local police relations with blacks. Quote, "Even before the rioting began then, there is ample evidence of friction between the black community and the police, an undeclared state of war, which was only overshadowed when the white crowd's aggressive stance against the black population became so severe that blacks were driven into police custody for their own protection," unquote. Jenkinson's thought pattern here is somewhat self-contradictory though. According to her, blacks felt comfortable going into police custody for protection, even though those same police were in a undeclared state of war against them. But yes, the British government, in response to these riots, did place several hundred blacks into camps and then deported them, which is of course something political activists will focus on incessantly. Until that is, they want to defend the casting of a black man in a heroic role leading British men in combat against the Nazis. Overall though, I would say that the historical evidence suggests that the British police in 1919 largely did their stated job in a fairly impartial manner. Again, the pattern we see in the analytical literature on these events is the tendency to assert that whenever the British press, police, or authorities said something in favor of blacks, they were telling the truth, and whenever they said something negative, they were simply racist. Take for example the following line from the Times, which some academics have noted. Quote, "Some of the more sober-minded citizens of Cardiff consider that the colored men are not alone to blame for the disturbances, although, at the same time, they deplore the familiar association between white women and Negroes, which is a provocative cause," unquote. Academics who cite this are quick to capitalize on it as evidence that the blame for the disturbances rested on racist, sexually jealous white men, because that would lessen the culpability of the colored persons involved. But all that line really states is that there were provocateurs on both sides, and locals didn't like foreigners engaging with their women. which isn't surprising for a racial conflict. But do also note here that this same article in the Times tells us that 6 Arabs were brought up on charges for shooting at the police, and that blacks freely used razors. The author describes how one police constable, quote, had a struggle with a big colored man who took out a razor and drew the blade across the constable's neck. He was so badly wounded that he had to be taken to the hospital, unquote. Also note how the whites repeatedly disarm all the blacks and Arabs of their razors and firearms, yet never use them themselves. The author finishes by explaining how the black man's chief failing was his, quote, fondness for white women, unquote. Now, to highlight even further just how biased the academic literature can be, I'll now discuss how it tends to depict Rufus Fennell, the so-called representative of Black Britons in 1919. Marxist historian Peter Fryer called Fennell an outstanding leader of Cardiff's black community. Christian Hogsbjerg, a PhD from the University of Brighton, called Fennell a remarkable black intellectual and activist. As Jacqueline Jenkinson herself writes, quote, the organizing ability of one black individual, Dr. Rufus Fennell, also should be highlighted in aiding the voices of ordinary black people to be heard, unquote. Jenkins then goes on to cite Peter Fryer. Quote, Rufus Fennell was a West Indian, medically trained in the United States, but not qualified in Britain, where he was working as a dentist. He had much medical experience in 314 days spent in the trenches, where he was wounded 3 times and he attended thousands of British soldiers. He had been living in Pontypridd, but came to Cardiff during the riots and quickly assumed leadership of the colored community, unquote. Indeed, Rufus initially appears to be a very noble, larger-than-life character, but upon investigation, it becomes fairly obvious that the man was a charlatan who told different media outlets a variety of stories. Curiously, Christian Hogsbjerg, who himself praises Fennell as a remarkable intellectual, reveals how various facets of Fennell's life story don't add up. Quote, in September 1950, the Black American magazine Ebony interviewed the 62-year-old Rufus E. Fennell, noting he was born in Savannah, Georgia, and originally left the U.S. seeking a job opportunity. According to the Liverpool Echo in November 1917, Fennell was a tailor by trade, though whether he was trained in the U.S. or elsewhere is unclear. In October 1917, the same paper had reported Fennell declaring himself an American subject, who had been in the American Army and had served at the Dardanelles as a volunteer in the British Navy, from which he got his discharge. And before that, in August, according to the Echo, Fennell described himself as a music hall artist, a master mechanic, tailor, and a former employee of the Admiralty Department. In 1917, the Manchester Evening News described him as an American citizen who claimed to be a boxer and who had been in the service of the British at the Dardanelles. Quite what Fennell's exact service for the Royal Navy during the First World War at the Dardanelles entailed remains unclear. The Ebony profile from 1950 described him as a one-time ship's cook. However, in June 1919, the South Wales News described Fennell as a colored medical man who has been in the trenches for 314 days, was wounded 3 times while serving in Mesopotamia, and who attended to thousands of our British soldiers, unquote. In his bibliography, Hogsbjerg places doubt on Fennell's supposed medical background. Quote, it is true that in July 1919, Fennell told a Western Mail reporter that he was a fully qualified doctor under American law, but that since leaving the States, he had not practiced. However, the South Wales News in late July 1919 questioned whether it was correct to describe Fennell as Dr. Fennell, as it had also done in an earlier report, given that he now only described himself as an expert dentist. Peter Fryer explains this anomaly by suggesting of Fennell that after arriving in Britain, he had moved to Wales, but lacking British medical qualifications, he had been practicing as a dentist in Pontypridd. However, one might question even Fennell's claim to specialist knowledge of dentistry, let alone medicine. We have seen that in 1917, Fennell was more modestly simply claiming his skills in professional work as a music hall artist, a master mechanic, and tailor, unquote. As an aside here, upon returning to the US, where Fennell was supposedly fully licensed to practice medicine, he was working as a doorman at the Black and Tan Alhambra Club, according to Jet magazine. Now, the bizarre nature of Hogsbjerg's paper, however, isn't exactly that he highlights any of this. It's that he makes endless excuses for Fennell's behavior. Regarding Fennell's allusions to being West Indian and denying his American birth, Hogsbjerg says, quote, "Admitting he was a black American would have only created unnecessary confusion, weakening any political demands he advanced during the riots. Describing himself as being from the West Indies, and so, like most of the rest of Cardiff's black community, meant he was now able to challenge the British government amidst and in the aftermath of the riots from the apparent perspective of someone who was speaking as a British subject. Fennell's claims, made in 1919, to being a doctor and some sort of highly respectable medical professional, rather than simply a music hall artist, might also need to be seen in this light." Unquote. Hogsbjerg even concludes his paper by saying that Fennell's life of, quote, "reinvention amidst adversity deserves to be recovered and remembered," unquote. So, in other words, Fennell was a liar, but he was a liar for all the right reasons. Rufus had also been involved in a number of legal cases prior to 1919. Earlier, in July of 1917, a white electrician, Thomas Oldfield, supposedly struck Fennell with a chair for harassing white women at the Southport Music Hall, where both men worked. Fennell pressed charges against Oldfield. As the Liverpool Echo reported, quote, "It was no use hiding the fact that the employment of a black man at the Pier Pavilion had caused prejudice in the minds of the staff. Complainant was not accustomed to deal with white women in the manner in which they should be dealt with. 2 women had left the place because they refused to be driven by him," unquote. The Manchester Evening News reported that Thomas Oldfield, quote, "had resented Fennell giving women employees work to do which they had no right to perform," unquote, and that Fennell, quote, "followed him as he came into the pavilion, challenged him to fight, grinned in his face, and he got his horrible breath," unquote. Thomas claimed that, quote, "he did not strike Fennell with the chair, and Fennell hurt himself through falling down the steps of the stage as he ran away when he, defendant, picked up the chair," unquote. In the Liverpool Echo, Fennell claimed that Oldfield had followed him on stage without invitation and threatened to settle him if they went outside. Somehow, Oldfield surprised Fennell with the chair after making this threat. Fennell additionally claimed to have been a professional boxer and, quote, "if he had known he was going to be struck, he could have avoided the blow," unquote. His accounting of events gets quite colorful, as the Echo reported, quote, "If Oldfield had had a revolver, Fennell would have defied Oldfield to draw at 6 feet distance," unquote. Now, to be fair, Eric Longden, the music hall's manager, said, quote, "he discharged Oldfield because he had also laid out another man previously," unquote. Oldfield himself denied this, but ultimately, the court appears to have sided with Fennell and fined Oldfield £5. So, if Rufus indeed suffered racial prejudice from men and women at the music hall, he certainly didn't suffer any in the local courts. Nevertheless, Fennell resigned from his position 2 days after Oldfield was fired. Now, maybe Fennell was indeed the victim at the Southport Music Hall, but there does seem to be a pattern of him getting involved in these sorts of situations. In 1924, Rufus found himself yet again in another physical altercation with someone who also denied his version of events, though this time the altercation was in London and concerned a native of Guyana. As the Daily Herald reported, quote, "An exciting scene in a cafe off Tottenham Court Road, London, which has since been raided by the police, was told at Marlborough Street yesterday when James Rich, 26, laborer, a British subject, but a native of British Guiana, was bound over for maliciously wounding Rufus Fennell, another man of color, with a hammer." Fennell had previously stated that they were playing dice at Erskine's Cafe at Whitfield Street when, after an altercation, he received a violent blow on the head. Rich strenuously denied the charge, stating that when he asked Fennell for money he owed him, Fennell pulled about 140 pounds in notes and a lot of silver from his pockets, saying if he touched it, he would blow his brains out. The detective sergeant said the cafe was a very bad place and had been raided to teach them a lesson, unquote. Now, curiously, a month after the Southport Music Hall incident, Rufus Fennell was back in court, this time for failure to pay £9 in arrears of maintenance, that is, child support. Now, Christian Hogsbjerg in his paper tries to create an air of sympathy for Rufus by blaming his inability to pay child support on the incident at the Southport Music Hall. Presumably, the angle is that the resignation was forced on Fennell by the racist staff members and thus left Rufus unable to pay his child support. Now, perhaps this is true, but as Hogsbjerg himself mentions, Rufus had already failed to pay the arrears back in August as well, when he told the court that he was a Freemason and had no plans to return to the entertainment industry, which he almost immediately did. At the November hearing, Rufus also claimed to have a contract to make 59,000 blouses, but was indebted some 115 pounds for the machinery required, hence he couldn't pay the arrears. As a local paper reported, quote, "The probation officer said he had been to defendant's premises and saw 2 sewing machines there. A warrant was issued to be suspended so long as defendant found 10 shillings a week," unquote. Now, the presence of the sewing machines does lend some credibility to Fennell's claims. However, I'm not entirely sure that 2 sewing machines would cost 115 pounds in 1917. That does seem a bit excessive. The advertisements I've seen from 1917 indicate that a hand-operated machine ran for about 3 pounds, and maybe around $35 if it was electric. Perhaps this explains why the court issued a warrant to be suspended so long as Fennell found 10 shillings a week. Regardless, by December, Rufus Fennell was back working in the entertainment industry, and it seems doubtful that one man, despite being a Freemason, a doctor, a dentist, and an expert mechanic, was going to be able to make 59,000 blouses in such a short span of time. Curiously, in July of 1919, Fennell was charged by an Arab lodging house owner for, quote, "obtaining 2 pounds by false pretenses," unquote. Academics have highlighted the fact that at trial, Fennell's lawyer called him a respectable man and believed that, quote, "certain persons were anxious to have him sent to prison," unquote. This is seen by academics as evidence that the racist powers at hand were intentionally thwarting Fennell's pro-black activism. Jacqueline Jenkinson states that the chief constable of Cardiff was, quote, "out to get Fennell." But the question naturally arises, why would the racist chief constable of Cardiff be out to get a man who Jenkinson highlights herself, quote, "believed that the solution to the problem of rioting in the city was repatriation," unquote. Indeed, part of Rufus Fennell's black activism was to argue for the repatriation of blacks. I suspect this was the case in part because there was money to be allocated by the British government for this very purpose. Again, Jenkinson herself notes that the local repatriation committee had given Fennell access to funds to enable black men to reach ports from which repatriation ships were leaving. As the Western Mail reported on July 19th, quote, "The charge on which the warrant was issued is that of obtaining money by false pretenses, and arises out of the alleged payment of the return fare of a colored man who was sent from Cardiff to Plymouth for repatriation, but insisted on returning on the ground that someone in Cardiff owed him money," unquote. It does seem at least plausible that Rufus could have been taking money for facilitating the repatriation of blacks, while in fact those blacks were not being repatriated. Ultimately, though, as the academics tend to highlight, the charges in this case against Fennell were dismissed after he explained to the court that, quote, "he had not paid the money because he had been very busy," unquote. Long after the riots in 1929, Rufus got into trouble again for willfully obstructing the footway at Salisbury Street. On Friday, August 9th, the West London Observer reported the following, quote, "The police stated that the defendant was in Salisbury Street on Sunday morning in the center of a large crowd, which blocked the footway and part of the carriageway. He was advertising a patent medicine. Other stallholders were prevented from carrying on their business. Defendant made no attempt to comply with a request of the police to reduce the obstruction and continued to address the crowd. Defendant said he was a licensed manufacturing chemist with a laboratory at Islington. He had no business premises at present, and so was selling his medicines in the streets and marketplaces. It was necessary for him to demonstrate his wares. Of course, a crowd collected. It was his object to collect a crowd in order to sell his goods. He was doing so on this day. The constable told him if he had nothing to sell, he would have to pack up. Defendant said he replied that he was not going to pack up because he had been standing there for years and had never been interfered with before. He held several licenses and was applying for one for this district, and a conviction for obstruction might interfere with him obtaining it. The magistrate said it was a difficult matter he could see. The defendant had an attractive way of addressing people with the result that he got a large number of listeners. It was possible to be the victim of too great success. Defendant could not be allowed to collect a big crowd and cause an obstruction. He must exercise his discretion and begin to sell before he got too many people around. The summons was dismissed under the Probation of Offenders Act on payment of 2 shillings. Costs," unquote. Once again, the charges against Fennell were ultimately dismissed, but do note Fennell admits to having practiced his unlicensed peddling in that very spot for, quote, years without interference. The paper claims that he held several licenses for other districts, but was in the process of obtaining one for this district. So naturally the question arises, why did he insist on peddling his wares here for several years and not in the districts wherein he held an actual license? It should be noted that these peddlers would work a crowd with an initial pitch before actually offering the sale of their often dubious goods. Nevertheless, all the police simply wanted Fennell to do was to get on with the actual sale and not block the carriageway, yet he refused. While the magistrate wanted Fennell to exercise discretion, again, Fennell clearly refused to do this, hence the interference of the police, who again didn't even seem to care that he didn't have a license. The point here, though, isn't to highlight that Fennell had committed some grave crime. Rather, it's to illustrate his general character. Rather than a Renaissance man whom a racist Briton thwarted at every turn, more likely he was an entertainer who would lie or embellish the truth in order to be the center of attention. In fact, many of the times he did appear in the local papers, it was for announcements of entertainment-related performances in which he participated. Although, in 1932, when he appeared again in the paper, it was because he had been imprisoned for stealing a mailbag and setting it on fire. He even admitted to it in court. However, in 1935, he appeared in the credits of a production called Stevedore, and again in 1937 for his role in the Paul Robeson film Jericho. After this, Rufus doesn't really show up again in the British press, but before returning to the US in 1951, he supposedly worked as a mushroom farmer, according to Ebony magazine. All in all, Rufus was married as many as 4 different times and fathered a number of children. Yet curiously, Fennell's British wife and 4 children, who all crossed the color line, left him an embittered old man with no family ties when he moved back to the US. Now, surely, some of the things Rufus claimed were true, but he clearly lied about a lot of his achievements in personal life, and it is perhaps telling that so many academics have attempted to craft such a noble image out of this clearly dubious persona. What does it say about the mainstream historical analysis of the 1919 race riots if the academics involved have held this man in such high regard? So until now, I've held back on delving into the whole white male sexual jealousy narrative that various academics like to play around with regarding the UK race riots of 1919. Now, if you read through old newspaper archives, there certainly was concern expressed over colored men interacting with white women. But over and over again, what we find in the primary source material is a very particular phrasing. A certain type of white woman, or a white woman of a certain temperament, and so on and so forth. In other words, we're talking about a subset or a minority. In fact, if anything, most local women at the time were as angry about this phenomenon as were local men. The South Wales News on June 16th reported that a crowd of mostly white women formed at the house of a black and white couple who had moved in with the white woman's parents. Quote, "A lively scene occurred at Taft's Well on Saturday evening over a colored man and his white wife. Both left Cardiff the previous day in consequence of the riots and came to stay at the home of the woman's parents in Cemetery Road, Taft's Well. When this became known, the people of the locality took objection to the presence of the man and made a noisy demonstration in front of the house. The crowd, which consisted mainly of women, became so threatening that the police had to interfere. The man's father-in-law, it is stated, was struck, but beyond this, there was no actual violence or damage done. Sergeant Thomas got the man to return to Cardiff in a taxi, and peace was thereupon restored." Unquote. The Times also reported that when a crowd of white men set fire to a Negro boarding house on Humphrey Street, a crowd of women formed and became angry with a woman found in the company of the blacks. Quote, "A young white woman was rescued from the premises, and the police, who escorted her away, had some difficulty in protecting her from other white women. At another point, a group of police were fired at by Negroes, and a bullet passed through the tunic of Police Constable Clark." Unquote. The Western Daily Press reported on June 17th that a white woman who was on trial for participating in the riots told another white woman present, who had married a black man, quote, "You ought to be burnt." Unquote. Now, insofar as to the most frequent context in which these white women were associating with colored men, consider that the Times had also reported back in May on a police raid of a local Negro gambling house. Quote, At midnight on Sunday, a gambling house in Chestnut Street, Liverpool, was raided by the police, and as the result, 14 Negroes and 3 white women appeared before the Liverpool Stipendiary Magistrate yesterday. It was stated that the Negroes put up a desperate struggle before being arrested, and several of them appeared in court wearing bandages. The occupant of the premises, Henry Williams, a Negro, was fined £25 with 2 months imprisonment for carrying on a gaming house. For assisting in its management, 2 other colored men were fined £10 each. The other Negroes and the women were bound over. 5 of the men were sentenced to 14 days imprisonment with hard labor for assaulting the police." Unquote. Now, to be fair, the Times also mentions, in a separate article covering the riots at the time, and in reference to the association of black men with local women, that, quote, "some of the men have made good husbands," unquote. This is, of course, highlighted as the norm by the academics covering these events, but it would seem that the women who did associate with foreign men in the port cities were more often than not prostitutes or some variation thereof. The Leicester Daily Post on June 17th reported that locals became angry and wrecked an Arab cafe that was clearly serving as a brothel. Quote, "Mohammed Rabul, an Arab from Aden, was summoned at the Thames Police Court yesterday afternoon for allowing a restaurant kept by him in Cable Street, St. George's East, to be frequented by women of loose character. The evidence of police officers was to the effect that white women of a certain class were in the habit of sitting in the place, getting into conversation with colored men, leaving with them, and returning shortly afterwards. It was further alleged that acts of gross indecency took place in the shop. Incidentally, it was mentioned that the defendant's shop had since been wrecked by a crowd of indignant white men. The magistrate said he was not clear in this case and dismissed the summons." Unquote. Considering the vague language here, and that the summons was ultimately dismissed by the magistrate, this clipping may seem inconclusive to people. It may even appear that white men were in fact just jealous. So some explanation is required. First, these newspapers were not exactly in the habit of explicitly stating certain indecent acts, but contemporary readers would have quite readily understood that the author was discussing prostitution here. And indeed, it is a commonly accepted fact today that Maltese men in particular became well known for running cafe brothels in Butetown, Cardiff, an area known to locals as Tiger Bay. In his 1948 thesis for the University of London, Kenneth Little gave a detailed outline of how the model went. To summarize, these men were using cafes as a cover business in order to whore out local women to black sailors. Prostitutes employed as waitresses would engage in conversations with customers and then invite them to a back room where the transaction would take place. The pimps would often get away with running these brothels because the police and the courts often couldn't prosecute them effectively due to the burden of providing proper evidence. But there was little doubt that these were in fact clandestine brothels. Now, to be fair, many of these prostitutes were older, willful participants who were fully cognizant of their actions and what this lifestyle entailed. But many were also young victims of coercion, trafficking, and exploitation. In fact, these events have an eerie similarity with the grooming gang phenomenon today. Kenneth Little also shared an anecdote in his notes. Quote, "The following example of one Cardiff girl is probably fairly typical of many others. A young girl of good class family had her pocket money stopped by her father, who did not approve of her expenditure on cosmetics. Mainly, no doubt, with the object of keeping up with her friends, the girl proceeded to steal some money and was subsequently sent to an approved school from which she ran away. She was then picked up by one of the Maltese proprietors while he was in another town. He proceeded to buy clothes for her and gradually to break her in. That is, accustom her to the life, art, and technique of prostitution, whilst looking after her. After this, she was more or less in the toils for good. She felt she could not return to her parents and was in constant fear lest the authorities should discover her. Lacking an experience of the world and without any means of coping with the situation in which she found herself, she simply accepted it as the only life open to her." Unquote. Now, Little was mostly discussing the period between 1920 and 1930, but in November of 1918, in Coventry, a colored herbalist, Benjamin Myro Smith, was charged with raping a 15-year-old girl in his employ. The particulars of the case suggest that he had engaged in grooming-like behaviors with several girls. He was eventually tried and convicted, but it took over a year because the victim couldn't attend court due to the fact that she had developed peritonitis as a result of being repeatedly and brutally raped. As the Coventry Standard reported in July of 1919, quote, Benjamin Myro Smith, aged 36, was indicted for a serious offense against the girl aged 15 at Coventry on September 26. Mr. R.A. Wiles was for the prosecution, and Mr. Nelson, Manchester, appeared for the prisoner, who pleaded not guilty. Under direction of the judge, the jury gave consideration to the most serious aspect of the case and returned a verdict of rape. Previous convictions were recorded, but not for offenses of this character. Superintendent Bassett of the Coventry City Police said the prisoner was a man of very low character. His method was to take a small shop and advertise for girl typists, and in that way, he got several young girls into his clutches and seduced them, two being mentioned who had given birth to black children. Scotland Yard Criminal Investigation Department described Smith as a procurer of white girls for immoral purposes. The judge, in sentencing the prisoner to 3 years penal servitude, said he was convinced that the prisoner was one of the pests of society and a regular corrupter of girls who got into his clutches and were unable to escape because of their tender age, unquote. Back in September of 1916, the South Wales News said some of the following about the situation in Cardiff. Quote, but the greatest evil of all is the importation into Tiger Bay of young girls from the hills and valleys of South Wales. They are tempted to come as domestic servants to the alien boarding houses, and it is not unusual to find sometimes as many as 3 or 4 of them from 15 to 17 years of age, ostensibly employed as domestics in a place packed to the roof with foreigners. Their degradation is all too frequently only a matter of weeks. They become part of the boarding house keeper's stock in trade, an attractive business asset, and, if questioned on the subject, they will tell you that they are engaged or married to one of the lodgers. It is pitiable to see some of the victims of this revolting system. Everyone with whom I discussed the matter said the evil could not be exaggerated. It baffled description, and no terms that could be used would be too strong to denounce it. I came away with the firm conviction that the authorities should absolutely prohibit the employment of white girls by aliens in this area. No girl should be allowed to enter these establishments. Let the occupiers employ male labor or women of mature years. To permit girls in their teens to enter is to send them to certain ruin, unquote. Even as far back as 1908, there was talk from locals in Cardiff about how black men essentially exploited local white women. In the July 8th issue of The Western Mail, a local shared his appraisal of the situation. Quote, there are a large number of houses in Niggertown which are of undisguised disreputability, and in which the white women are, in the accepted sense of the phrase, the white slaves of black men. The master of the house is black. The mistress of the house, who pays the rent and earns it, is white, unquote. Now, the work of Nancy Sharp, a local woman who wrote a report on blacks in Cardiff in 1932, may be informative here. I currently don't have access to her papers, but Simon Jenkins, a leftist academic, has referenced her numerous times throughout his own work. His doctoral thesis, Prostitution in Cardiff, 1900 to 1959, is 400 plus pages of him psychoanalyzing and pathologizing nativists backlash. But he quotes Sharp directly at one point, stating that her accounts spoke of men who were, quote, hot-blooded, extremely interested in sex, and more desirous of a sexual outlet, and often, in their wish for this, they make use of a girl of 17, 16, or even 15, whom an Englishman would still consider a child. This is because people from hot countries mature before people in more temperate climates, and the social customs are different, unquote. Now, Nancy Sharp was convinced that this behavior was a pronounced trend among blacks and that it stemmed from aggregate racial differences. While it may offend people, you can find several modern studies from liberal institutions reaffirming these quote-unquote racist notions. For example, it is a commonly accepted fact today that black girls reach menarche significantly earlier than white girls, on average a full year earlier. Beyond any of these notions of racial differences, however, it is simply a matter of the historical record that Europeans married much later in life, exercised a great deal of abstinence until doing so, and largely remained monogamous. For more information on this, see Kevin MacDonald's Individualism in the Western Liberal Tradition, specifically Chapter 4. But as MacDonald also highlights in his work, historically, it was a perfectly normal thing in Britain to have your young sons or daughters go out and work in the households and businesses of nominal strangers in your community without any concern for their possible mistreatment. With this in mind, the peoples showing up in Britain in the early 20th century were largely from polygamous societies that often saw girls as sexually available at much younger ages. The aforementioned Benjamin Monroe Smith was able to take advantage of high-trust British social norms in this regard in order to exercise his sexual inclinations on young girls the local community had passively assumed he would respect. Now, getting back to the work of academic Simon Jenkins, he also posits cultural differences contributed to the interracial strife in the UK race riots, although he does so through an anti-nativist lens. He subtly criticizes the notion of local authorities that monogamy was central to British moral code, and he takes issue with how they contrasted their local morality against other, quote, forms of masculinity to mark out racial difference, unquote. He posits that their worldview echoed, quote, colonial notions of alternative sexualities as being immoral or amoral, unquote. He repeatedly psychoanalyzes the behavior of the Chief Constable of Cardiff, James Wilson, who said the following in one of his reports to the Home Office concerning Maltese sex cafes. Quote, Number 212 Bute Street is kept as a cafe by a Maltese named Jack Gauchi and his wife, who was formerly a prostitute. They have living with them another Maltese named Tony Farrugia and his wife, who was formerly a prostitute. A fortnight after the marriage of Mrs. Farrugia, she was found in the act of prostitution with an African Negro with the knowledge and consent of her husband, who was keeping observation outside the door of the room whilst immorality took place, unquote. Now, also of interest here is another element of Kenneth Little's 1948 thesis, wherein he comments on the polyandrous practices of the colored community in Cardiff during the interwar years. Quote, a number of households are run on more or less polyandrous lines. In addition to either a legal or socially recognized husband, such a woman may have one or even two other temporary husbands, whom she accommodates in her house on their return from sea. In some cases, she is virtually a professional freelance. In a few cases, the husband connives at the practice. In others, where it is less frequent, he may be unaware of what is going on. In any case, the woman concerned is in receipt as a rule of at least two and sometimes even more separate allotments, which in a general sense may be regarded as retaining fees. The business, though precarious, can be a very profitable one while it lasts, unquote. Now, of course, this account renders the female actors involved much less a victim of exploitation and more calculating in their actions. It should be stressed here, however, that what Little is describing is not the organized cafe model. He is describing one aspect of the behavior of the subset of local women who married foreign men. It by no means discounts the other stories of exploitation. If anything, it highlights a larger point, which is that these people were often not married in a traditional British sense, even when they appeared to be. Now, of course, people like Simon Jenkins might respond here by placing traditional British sense in quotation marks. In their minds, the only aspect of British culture that is set in stone appears to be some sense of colonial racism and exploitation. Jenkins also highlights how local women, in some instances, even helped run the Maltese brothels. In one of his papers, he notes, quote, court records also reveal that Maltese men sometimes ran cafes in conjunction with their British wives or partners, an aspect almost wholly overlooked in the vitriolic rhetoric of the police and the press. As such, while some Maltese were clearly involved in the organization of prostitution, the perception that this was something ingrained in all Maltese men negatively impacted upon the socioeconomic experiences of Maltese seafarers as a whole, unquote. Do take note that Jenkins' primary concern here is not that local women, that is his women, were being exploited by foreigners. Rather, his primary concern is the socioeconomic repercussions for individual Maltese sailors who may have become unjustly associated with the sex cafes due to racism. Jenkins highlights what he sees as a blind spot. Because some British women were active in the exploitation of other British women, this somehow meant that Chief Constable Wilson should have ignored the fact that, as Jenkins states himself, Maltese men owned up to 67% of these cafes. In terms of who was running the rest of the cafes, Kenneth Little stated in his book that, quote, Cafe proprietors are mostly Maltese, but there are other nationalities in the business, such as Indians, Jews, and Africans," unquote. Now, putting all that aside, I doubt Jenkins would argue that today Southeast Asians can't complain about British sexpats or draw any sort of broad conclusions because some local women there are pimps. Likewise, I doubt Jenkins would argue that because some Africans captured and sold fellow Africans to British slavers, and because the overwhelming majority of British people didn't participate in slavery, that most British individuals today shouldn't have to cater to collective black grievances. And if someone wishes to remind me here that the British people nevertheless benefited in an ancillary fashion from slavery, the same argument can be applied to these Maltese sailors here who didn't run these sex cafes. As Kenneth Little highlighted in his work, these foreign-owned lodging houses and cafes often functioned as a de facto workers' union or ethnic co-op of a sort that would provide their co-ethnics with credit as needed and would even procure job opportunities by bribing local officials. So yes, the very funds these whorehouses made off local women indeed could and did benefit Maltese sailors beyond the obvious room, board, and recreational activities. Now, concerning Nancy Sharp's observation of the hypersexuality of black men, this may actually have played a role in the motivations of the more willful and cognizant prostitutes, or freelance wives, if you will, during the period, insofar as is concerned any assertion that white women actually favored black men, which is something you hear quite often from these leftist academics who assert white men rioted because they were jealous. Note that local newspapers repeatedly commented that black men would more freely spend their money, as one policeman noted in April of 1919, quote, "The colored sailor draws a lot of money when he is paid off, and he spends it freely. To get through 50 pounds in the first week is a common occurrence," unquote. It seems fairly obvious here that prostitutes are going to be more likely to pursue any group of men who have more disposable cash and a greater desire for sex. Again, black men in Cardiff were overwhelmingly single at the time and had few related financial obligations. Simon Jenkins stated that one motive claimed by women accused of prostitution at the petty sessions was that they, quote, "had sold sex to replace income lost through unemployment," unquote. At one point, he also stated that, quote, "women facing magistrates were often from impoverished backgrounds and utilized prostitution as part of a makeshift economy of precarious labor," unquote. Now, if these were black women engaged in such a model of prostitution with white men, I would wager that most people would find the situation deplorable, even if the women involved were nominally willful participants. But moving on from these considerations, many of the historical sources cited as evidence of white women favoring black men before and/or during World War II are often liberally misconstrued, exaggerated, or recontextualized for ideological purposes. One of the more prominent writers on black history in Britain, James Walvin, writes in his book, The Negro in English Society, that relationships between black males and white women in Britain flourished wherever the two groups met, and refers to English concerns over miscegenation as male phobias. But some of the sources Walvin cites are just flat out dubious. For example, J.A. Rogers, a Jamaican American who claimed in his book Sex and Race, Negro-Caucasian Mixing, that Charlotte Sophia and Beethoven were black, or at least had black African ancestry. Alongside such colorful claims are cherry-picked quotations from sources that, if read in full, argue something quite different. As evidence of white male insecurity demonstrated in the popular press, both Walvin and Rogers cite an old issue of the English Review from 1919. There's an article in it entitled "Black Men and White Women." The author states at one point that, quote, "there was no concealment of the affectionate attitude of a certain type of white female towards the brown, black, or yellow male," unquote. Now, both Walvin and Rogers seem to be quite taken by this quotation, but this sentence, even on its own, evidences very little beyond the fact that, as the author stated, a certain type of white female is affectionate toward black men. In other words, a small minority or subset. It doesn't say hordes of white women or even a substantial amount of white women. Later on, the author even states, quote, "it is generally a very low type of Englishwoman who will consort with the Negro," unquote. Moreover, the same article goes on to highlight black male insecurities. Quote, In describing the Negro as repulsive, there is here no intention of being either unkind or critical. It is a cold statement of physiological fact, admitted by the friends of the blacks, and indeed put forward by their most responsible and intelligent writers, as the real cause of all Negro misery on earth, unquote. The author then quotes a black professor, Ronner Maxwell, quote, "I am a Negro of pure descent. I have traveled a little. I have been educated at Oxford, where students congregate from all parts of the world. I have been at the Inns of Court, where I have also seen and formed the acquaintance of many members of the various races who are linked together by allegiance to the British Crown. But I must confess with regret that, except the Chinese, I have never seen another race approaching, even within a measurable distance, the Negro in ugliness," unquote. The article goes on to highlight other intellectuals who apparently, quote-unquote, realized their own race's, quote-unquote, hideousness, and asserted that the only way to ameliorate their condition was to breed with the, quote-unquote, superior races. Now, I'm not claiming that there were no white British girls who found black males attractive. Clearly there were. But to get a sense of the proportion, let's consider that during World War II, there were as many as 150,000 African Americans stationed in Great Britain. If relations flourished wherever these two groups met, then how many pregnancies might we expect to have resulted? Certainly more than 2,000, which is the highest estimate I've ever seen. Feminist author and researcher Lucy Bland informs us, quote, "By 1948, letters sent by the League of Colored Peoples to welfare organizations of each county in England and Wales uncovered 775 such children. The League of Colored Peoples recognized, however, that many babies would not have fallen within the remit of a welfare agency. If we look comparatively at the German experience, we can conjecture that it was probable that well over half of the British brown babies were kept by their birth families and were thus unlikely to have been registered by welfare officials. However, unlike in Germany, no centralized demographic statistics were recorded, so it is impossible to know exactly how many brown babies were born. In 1947, George Padmore estimated 1,700. In 1949, Dr. Malcolm Joseph Mitchell, who was General and Traveling Secretary of the League of Colored Peoples, estimated the number of children of white women and colored servicemen to be approximately 2,000, although he might have been including children with West Indian fathers," unquote. Honestly, the numbers just aren't that impressive. Britain's total population in the 1940s was about 48 million. Let's assume roughly half of that was female. That's 24 million white women to 150,000 black males, and the result was maybe 2,000 babies. Now, some might argue here that Britain's de facto segregation policy helped limit the ability of black men to mingle freely with all the white women who found them simply irresistible. Of course, entertaining this notion detracts from Call of Duty Vanguard's fantasy that the British authorities would have placed Arthur Kingsley in charge of white troops. Regardless, if we are to factor in that more white women would have been impregnated by black men were it not for Britain's racist authorities, we should also consider that African American GIs made something like 5 times the amount of money that British soldiers did, and that they had access to all sorts of commercial goods that the British civilians didn't due to rationing. At the time, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that, quote, "American Negroes, treated for the first time in their lives like white folks, so eager to find someone to spend their incredible wealth on, could give the girls fun and luxuries their husbands had never been able to give them," unquote. Again, we have mixed signals here. Du Bois seems convinced that blacks had complete and unrestricted access to white women. Now, whatever the case really was, the African American press at the time did enjoy portraying black men as exceedingly popular with British women, due to things like being able to jitterbug better than white men. Now, Du Bois may have fantasized about black men cuckolding British men off fighting the Nazis, but the numbers don't really speak to this being very widespread. Indeed, despite the stress of war, the absence of their husbands, and the economic advantages black GIs had over their British male counterparts, white British women still didn't find black males all that appealing. Now, I do think it's true that the indigenous peoples of the British Isles were comparatively friendly toward and even accommodating to black GIs. But as usual, these articles largely mischaracterize the historical record in order to convince modern Brits that historically British people never thought of themselves as quote-unquote white, unlike those misguided and retardedly backward blokes across the pond. Sure, it might give some white bourgeois liberal in the UK a temporary dopamine drip to think so, but do note here that such articles have zero effect on BAME activism's desire to keep native Brits in perpetual penance for the sins of colonial racism. So what was the actual case during the war, and how did white Brits actually feel toward the black GIs? Well, as David Reynolds highlights in his paper, locals saw the black GIs as temporary guests who would eventually leave. They didn't see them as their peers in some modern colorblind sense. In his review of Graham Smith's book, When Jim Crow Met John Bull, David Reynolds tells us that the evidence suggests that black popularity waned as the war progressed, and that most Britons drew the line firmly at miscegenation. Indeed, if you dig through the British newspaper archives, aside from seeing a pattern of African Americans raping and murdering British locals, you can also find a fair amount of cases wherein locals voiced their disapproval of white women who mingled with black troops, and young teenage girls being sent away to reform schools after they were found associating with black troops. Now, Lucy Bland did assert in her work that historically it was a, quote, racist assumption that darker races were physically attracted to the fairer, but not vice versa, unquote. The problem here, however, is that we have modern data on dating preferences in multiracial societies with extreme egalitarian leanings, and on average, members of either sex of all races still seem to prefer white partners. For example, a fairly recent study by Cornell University compiled data from online dating sites in the US and found that, quote, heterosexual women of all races prefer white over non-white partners. White men and women of all ages are more likely to pursue dates with white rather than non-white partners and are least likely to date outside their race, unquote. The study also informs us that black men and women are, quote, 10 times more likely to message whites on an intimate platform than whites are to message blacks, unquote. The authors even found it troubling that so many user profiles were, quote, laced with phrases like no blacks, sorry, no Indians, no Asians, no Africans, or only here. 2011 census data in the UK involving interracial dating, marriage, and cohabitation revealed that white British were least likely to be in inter-ethnic relationships, followed by Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian ethnic groups. Now, the census does say that of all people in inter-ethnic relationships, 4 in 10 included someone who was white British. However, note that the most common inter-ethnic pairing was between other white and British ethnicities. So you can see how some people might try to play fast and loose with this last fact in order to raise the appearance of how popular so-called inter-ethnic pairings are. The fact is, white Brits typically stick to their own, even if the media wants to portray a different picture. Unironically, I think the video game Call of Duty Vanguard can help us understand why the media wants to endlessly depict foreign men with local white women. So we'll now return to that. So the opening mission of Call of Duty Vanguard tasks our black hero, Arthur Kingsley, with leading a team of white men behind enemy lines to recover intel on the super-secret Nazi Project Phoenix. The team battles across the top of a Nazi train outside of Hamburg, Germany, as it's being invaded by the Allies in 1945. Note our black hero's apparent glee as he sees the German city burning.
Would you look at that?
The tall protruding building on fire in the background is likely the St. Nicholas Church, which was for a brief period of time the tallest building in the world and is well known for being partially destroyed in the firebombing. Now, technically, while Hamburg was invaded by the Allies in 1945, it was only firebombed in 1943, but still I can't help but get the impression, looking at the backdrop here, that Activision was referencing the 1943 firebombing, also known by the Allied powers as Operation Gomorrah, which was a reference to the Jewish god Yahweh utterly destroying the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'll leave you to wonder why they would choose to use that name. Of course, Activision doesn't explore this subtle reference much further. No scenes of huddled masses in a cellar being cooked alive by the intense heat, no images of children's bones being turned to jelly, no screams of old women being sucked into a fiery vortex, and no agonizing shrills of folks as their feet sink into the melting asphalt. Instead, we get this black man's shit-eating grin. But I digress. Eventually, our heroes get captured by the evil Nazis and are interrogated by an effeminate, borderline homosexual-sounding Friesenberg, who calls into question Arthur Kingsley's British identity. We'll watch the scene play out and then examine its components.
Your Rhineland accent. You must be from Neustadt. During the occupation, you saw French soldiers who look like me carry guns in your streets. Marry your women. That's what I hear when you speak German.
What Arthur Kingsley is referencing here is the French occupation of German towns along the Rhine River after World War I. This was known as Die Schwarze Schmack am Rhein, or in English as the Black Horror on the Rhine. The French employed black and North African colonial troops, and these troops were accused by local Germans of engaging in mass rapes. These accusations have been dismissed by modern scholars as the product of a racist German propaganda campaign. But the truth, as I will attempt to evidence, is that while we can debate as to the exact extent of the atrocities, the accusations probably reflected very real-life phenomena, and ironically, the dismissal of the accusations may have been the product of anti-German propaganda, both at the time and throughout the 20th century. Now, regardless, the developers at Activision invoked this historical event here with an express intent of shaming German men who had to live under the rule of armed foreigners who were, quote-unquote, marrying local German women. The use of this term, marrying, is most assuredly a denial and reorientation of the alleged mass rapes. But again, the overall tenor of this scene is meant to shame German men. Even absent a context of mass rapes or racial dynamics, it should hardly be expected that any men of any ethnic group would not feel some kind of shame when their women were either voluntarily sleeping with the enemy or being raped by them. Either scenario is indeed a sign of conquest. Try floating the idea to someone like David Lammy, for example, that his Scottish ancestry was the result of a black woman consenting to have sex with a white man she found attractive due to his social status, and see what kind of response you get. But let's discuss the Rhineland occupation in more depth now. In 1920, after Germany surrendered, the French military deployed between 30,000 and 40,000 colonial troops to the Rhineland to police the local population. Now, those figures are disputed by some, most notably General Henry Allen in a report written in 1921. Allen claimed that there were only about 25,000. Regardless though, colonial troops did occupy the Rhineland. They were made up of men from Algeria, Tunis, Morocco, Madagascar, and West Africa. Eventually, there was a series of allegations against the French military claiming that these troops had been committing mass atrocities against locals. Now, the most notable English-language compilation of evidence is a series of pamphlets written by Edmond Morel, a journalist born to a French father and an English mother. Most famously, in April of 1920, the Daily Herald published his article, Black Scourge in Europe, Sexual Horror Let Loose by France on the Rhine. In it, Morel claimed that there was a deliberate policy of importing sexually unrestrained men into Germany in order to inflict harm on locals. The economic poverty in which the Versailles Treaty plunged the working and middle classes in Germany was an incentive to prostitution. Quote, "The men who are doing this know what they are doing and why they are doing it. What inextinguishable fires of hatred are being accumulated upon the head of the French people, innocent as a people for these things, the future will only too clearly show. As a distinguished soldier said to me the other day, were I a German, I would forgive everything, but this, never." Unquote. Eventually, Morel started writing a series of pamphlets further detailing the events. These were translated into a number of languages and widely distributed, despite Allied efforts to have them censored. Now, while Morel did use what today would be considered disparaging language to describe Africans, he curiously expressed anger at French militarists for using Africans as cannon fodder in European conflicts. Indeed, Morel had previously written numerous books denouncing European imperialism. For example, he wrote about the rubber trade and King Leopold's policies in the Congo. In fact, quite a few academics today regularly cite his work when discussing the evils of European colonialism. Yet, when it comes to Morel's assertions about the Rhineland occupation, his claims are suddenly and rigorously scrutinized. Morel wrote in some detail on how the French military demanded local German towns establish and maintain brothels for colonial troops, and that when they protested, they were threatened. The mayor of one town in the Palatinate, who demurred when requested to set up a brothel, was told that hesitation on his part would render him liable to be brought before a military court. The officials then told him that if a brothel was not established, quote, German women, girls, and boys would suffer the unavoidable consequences, unquote. As Morel informs us, however, brothels or no, the German women, girls, and boys still suffered the unavoidable consequences. Children as young as 7 were assaulted and raped on their way to and from school. When local women were able to escape their assailants and seek aid, they were told by French officials that their assailants had, quote, not been home for 2.5 years, that these things must happen, unquote. Sometimes the authorities pointed to their fair hair and remarked that the black soldiers are partial to blondes. Quite remarkably, several women's rights organizations at the time spoke out against the use of colored troops in Germany. The International Women's League sent a petition to the League of Nations demanding their withdrawal. In Sweden, the premier discussed the atrocities at the Riksdag, and some 50,000 Swedish women signed a similar petition. In Germany, the Rhenish Women's League published and distributed their own advocacy material, wherein they too shared the details of numerous cases. Now, today we're repeatedly told to #BelieveAllWomen, but apparently this axiom carries with it some fine print. With this in mind, and considering how often feminists deplore victim blaming, it should be emphasized here that something Morel and his female allies had to contend with at the time was the constant accusation that German women were lying. Then, to add insult to injury, they were further slandered with counter-accusations of being sexually promiscuous. I'll cite a statement by the Rhenish Women's League here. Quote, our press has espoused our cause. Some in foreign countries have given utterance in our behalf, and our government has also voiced a protest. But those into whose power we have come, the representatives of French militarism and imperialism, proclaimed mockingly that our press and our government were lying. Not the white woman on the Rhine was to be protected before the yellow and black soldiers of the French Republic, but vice versa. The nigger of the island of Madagascar ought to be protected against the immoral influence of the white women on the Rhine, unquote. This idea that German women were sexually promiscuous is something two particular journalists at the time, Maximilian Harden and J. Ellis Barker, may have initiated and then helped promote. Curiously, it turns out that both men were Jews who had grown up in Germany, which is a relevant fact because even in the 1920s, Jews and Germans were known to harbor animosity toward each other. But in any event, in 1921, Barker wrote a paper about the events in the Rhineland. He quotes Harden, who said some of the following, quote, the African Negro type, which one finds constantly displayed in the bitter cartoons of the German comic papers, does not resemble in the slightest the type of the French colonial soldiers. Unfortunately, we have seen the aberrations of the female sex every time when Hagenbeck has shown us tribes of natives. Everywhere, the German women followed the black and yellow men and pestered them with love letters, flowers, and presents. They were not repelled by their smell. On the contrary, they found in it a special stimulus, a special attraction. However, these natives were birds of passage. They were only too often malnourished and sickly. They were rarely men of fine physique. They compare unfavorably with the warriors whose jet black skin covers splendid muscles and who are clad in striking uniforms, unquote. Harden was claiming that German women found even the smelliest and ugliest of black men attractive. He was referencing African men who had previously traveled to Germany in Hagenbeck's ethnological expositions. His thought process was that since German women had already found these uglier, smellier Negroes attractive, then they would go absolutely crazy for France's colonial troops, who were much finer specimens decked out in flashy uniforms. Now, even if we assume that Harden was describing a real-life phenomenon here, how is it exactly that he knew German women found a, quote, special stimulus, a special attraction, in what was normally considered the repellent smell of Negroes. Did he conduct a survey? To me, it seems obvious that Hardin was mocking the German public at the expense of blacks. Barker was himself just as absurd in his rendition of the events. In the same paper, he recounted how he had visited the region for a period of 3 weeks. Quote, "I was told that both the German police and the French authorities in the occupied districts found it very difficult to prevent the German women from pestering and pursuing the colored troops. In many cases, the colored soldiers themselves complained to their officers about the shameless advances made to them by German women, and frequently a military guard had to be called out to keep women from entering the barracks by the windows." Unquote. This is clearly counter-propaganda intended to shame both German men and women, and this is exactly the kind of behavior the Rhenish Women's League expressed anger about in their pamphlets. Not only were their plights ignored, but they were called liars and slandered with accusations of sexual promiscuity with black men, whom literally every major Western power at the time looked down on as inferior. Indeed, no one in the press at the time who accused German women of having relations with black men was doing so with some modern anti-racist sensibility. It was done with hostile intent, and it was aimed at defamation. Now, the detractors of German accusations will invariably bring up that General Henry Allen's report asserted that French authorities had told him there were only 66 total accusations of rape reported to them against the colored troops between 1918 and 1920. But, beyond the simple consideration that the French authorities were withholding information, do note that Allen said the following, quote, "On the other hand, undoubtedly many instances have occurred where women or girls have been assaulted, and some where boys and men have been sodomized by members of the French colored colonial troops. See report above as to the official figures. There are undoubtedly cases which are not included in the official figures due to the natural desire to keep out of obscene notoriety. For example, a case of attempted assault was reported June 14, 1920 from Saarbrücken, which is not included in the French official figures. Some cases will never come to light due to the natural feeling of shame of the women concerned." Unquote. Interestingly, the Rhenish Women's League specifically addressed this at the beginning of their pamphlet. Quote, "We, German women on the Rhine, are compelled, much against our innermost sentiments, to lay before the public the following pages. Whoever would read them will understand our reluctancy and will appreciate the fact that we have battled with ourselves for a long time before we could resolve upon this step. For what we are telling, what we call out into the world 1,000-fold, is our own disgrace. It is more than that. It is the degradation of the white woman as such. And on the main, it is so horrifying and terrible that we must ask all those reading it to place themselves in our condition if they want to understand why we dare to go before the public. It is only the feeling of complete impotence and hopelessness which has caused us to overcome our natural reluctancy and which has opened our mouths." Unquote. Something else that detractors like to highlight is that in Allen's report, several German newspapers admitted to having, quote, "employed certain terms and expressions which they might better have omitted," unquote. This is often seen as a straightforward admission of guilt, but in the same report, Allen tells us that those newspapers made those statements after the Allied forces suspended their publishing for 15 days. In other words, they probably made those statements under threat of being shut down entirely. It should additionally be noted here that the French government issued a summons against Le Populaire, a French newspaper in Paris that had published various segments of the Daily Herald article. Now, with that in mind, several other considerations should be made here. The French elites had imperial ambitions at the time, which arguably hindered on the perception of successful use of colonial troops in Europe. Charles Maugin, a French military man, had written a book in 1910 called La Force Noire, in which he argued that masses of black troops should be recruited from the French colonies in the event of a war in Europe. France had a much smaller population than Germany at the time, and there was concern that the nation couldn't compete with Germany in terms of sheer manpower. Long before World War I, France had been recruiting and utilizing black troops in Africa for various campaigns in that region. A French woman by the name of Bontin wrote a book in 1894 about her experiences traveling there. In her section dedicated to the behavior of black troops, she informs us that black troops serving in Africa were very accustomed to taking war brides and captives, a term she insists had become a euphemism for slaves. Quote, "These black recruits were happy to serve as soldiers, but it is not, as one might think, the taste for panache, nor the pleasure of fighting which excites them, even though they adore flashy colors and gunshots. Their dream, their ambition, their goal, which they admit with touching cynicism, is to win captives, that is to say, to possess slaves of their own. Yes, they know they will form a column against Samori or Amadou, that the latter will be defeated once again thanks to the science of the Tubab, and because we now have all the Grigri, and then captives will be taken from the enemy, who will become the property of the Tirailleurs. This disgrace had to be tolerated officially in order to prevent further abuses, and also because, absent the prospect of winning captives, the black man would no longer enlist. No money, no Swiss mercenaries. No slaves to ravage, no Negro soldier." Unquote. A quick note here. Tubab and Grigri were local African terms for white people and magical amulets, respectively. Essentially, the local Africans saw the white Frenchman as a kind of sorcerer who was able to give them magical powers on their quest to acquire more slaves. Now, yes, Bontemps wrote this more than 20 years before the Rhineland occupation, but she does evidence a certain reflection of African culture very much in line with what Morel and the Rhenish Women's League claimed. Moreover, historian Anthony Clayton wrote extensively about the French colonial army in 1988, and on pages 336 to 337 of his book, France, Soldiers, and Africa, he actually strengthens Bontemps' claims. Quote, "A number of Africans volunteered for the Tirailleurs, attracted by a sense of adventure and new experience, uniforms, the rate of pay, 3 meals a day, and the prospect of capturing women after a victorious campaign. 3 or 4 women, épousses libres, might be one soldier's reward. These could be kept or sold. Sometimes scandals arose from this practice, officers being reprimanded and disciplined, including in 1894 Mangin, who was placed in detention for 30 days. Unquote. It does seem quite reasonable to assume here that if these troops had a cultural custom, a unit tradition if you will, of treating women like this back in Africa, then they would have carried over this mentality into Europe and probably would have expected to be allowed to treat the vanquished Germans in a similar manner. This is in fact more or less what the accusations reflected, that these men were from largely polygamous and hypersexual societies that were alien to European customs and sensibilities. Again, even today, West Africa has retained a high level of polygamy, child marriages, and yes, rape.
Priscilla is only 16 years old, but already a hardened Durban prostitute.
I don't know if she's going to see 21 if she goes on like this.
With her, a member of a special police task force investigating child prostitution. A few days ago, Priscilla was arrested by police and is now spilling the beans. She has information on a Nigerian sex and drug syndicate that enslaves children with drugs and sells them for sex. Several underage girls are held captive here. Nigerian drug dealers lure them into their web of sex and deceit when they offer them refuge and then force-feed them drugs. When they're addicted, they have to pay their pimps for the drugs by having sex with clients. The 14-year-old Candace has been enslaved by her Nigerian masters for about 7 months. She's now a crack cocaine and heroin addict. She provides the task team with a harrowing insight into her enslavement.
Now, regarding African sexual norms, I do want to highlight here the work of Maryse Condé, who wrote a book in the 1980s called Ségou. The book centers around an 18th century African kingdom and follows the lives of 4 brothers as they traveled throughout the region. The book is quite startling insofar that it contains a lot of rape. In one case, Brother Tiakoro sees a beautiful slave girl in a market, and, overcome with passion, he rapes her. Quote, "The country yard was empty. The girl had finished kindling her fire and was standing with her hands hanging idle and her long, wiry legs slightly apart, showing the inside of the thighs. Tiakoro flung himself on her and dragged her into the privy. He did not know what possessed him. It was as if some savage beast lurking in his belly were trying to tear its way out. He entered her, and she gave a little cry like a child, but didn't try to defend herself. He took her several times, avenging himself for the long months of solitude, for his abstinence, and also for the disappearance of his younger brother. At last he pulled away. He was aware now of the terrible stench of excrement and urine, and wished he could die on the spot. He went out into the country yard. The girl followed. He would have liked her to fight him, to cry out, but she just stood there behind him, silent." Unquote. In a separate scene, another brother, Malobali, is insulted by a prepubescent girl and rapes her as punishment. I'll spare you the details of that, but if you're curious, it's on page 229. What's also striking about the book is that while the rapists often do feel some remorse for their actions, they are all depicted as not having the ability to control their actions, and more striking still, all the victims eventually fall in love with them. Now, while the book is fictional, it's meant to reflect pre-colonial African cultural norms. In fact, I was assigned this book in college by a black female professor in a course about pre-colonial African history. Thus, Africans themselves will sometimes acknowledge that historically they've had a very different perspective on sexual relations. So when men like Edmund Morel characterized them and other equatorial peoples as being different from Europeans, he wasn't being irrational, disingenuous, or even biased. He was merely relating facts. Now, if people wish to debate the cause of these differences, they can do so, but to this day, Africa does have an extremely high prevalence of rape. It should also be noted here that in 1944, over 2 decades after the Rhineland occupation, men from many of these same French colonial units were once again accused of massive rapes, this time by Italians during the Allied invasion of Italy. These were known to locals as les Maroquinate, which roughly translates as Moroccan deeds, although the term wasn't exclusive to Moroccans, but rather referenced all French colonial troops. The main culprits here, however, were the Goumiers, who were North African Arabs and Berbers. Now, the Italian accusations followed a highly similar pattern to those from the Germans in the 1920s. Victims included women as old as 86 and children as young as 11. The National Association for the Victims of the Maroquinate states that there were a minimum of 20,000 documented acts of physical violence. However, they also inform us that this is a conservative estimation. Statements from doctors and other professionals at the time revealed that about a third of the people raped probably didn't report it due to a sense of shame. Also, as was the case in the 1920s with the Germans, the Allied press in the 1940s accused local Italians of having exaggerated the situation. Indeed, many locals may have found the authorities entirely unsympathetic if and when they even tried to report their case. Now, to give a sense of just how extreme the situation was for some Italian locals, official Italian government documents from 2010 acknowledged the account of the mayor of Espedia, a small town of 2,500 inhabitants of whom he claimed 700 were raped. The local men there who tried to intervene were beaten and sodomized themselves. Even a local priest was raped all night after he tried to hide several of Espedia's women, and subsequently he died due to his injuries. Now, reportedly, things got so bad that Pope Pius XII took action, demanding that the French commanders put a stop to these atrocities and that they forbid these colonial troops from advancing any further to Rome. With these Italian accusations against colored troops in mind, I want to highlight a relevant side note. Many American viewers are probably familiar with the civil rights case of Emmett Till, a young African American who was killed during the 1950s, supposedly for having offended and assaulted a white woman. Now, it's not my aim here to get into the particulars of that case, as interesting as they are, but coincidentally, Emmett's own father had served in the US Army in Italy during World War II. Private Louis Till of the Army's 177th Port Company, 397th Port Battalion, was tried and convicted of raping 2 Italian women and murdering a third. He was executed by hanging on July 2nd, 1945. Indeed, as a general rule, African Americans were highly overrepresented in rape accusations in occupied Europe, most notably and ironically in France of all places. In the book, What Soldiers Do, Sex in the American GI in World War II, France, the author Mary Louise Roberts primarily sets out to, as she states herself, quote, debunk an old myth about the GI, thought of as a manly creature that was always behaved well. The GIs were having sex anywhere and everywhere, unquote. But she encounters a problem on her quest to smear the supposed greatest generation. The politically incorrect fact comes up that blacks were disproportionately accused, tried, convicted, and executed for rape in Allied-occupied France. As Roberts states in her book, quote, 77% of court-martial convictions for rape in the European theater of operations concerned African American soldiers, unquote. This is, of course, on top of the fact that African Americans only comprised about 10% of US forces. So naturally, Roberts is left with no choice but to begin undermining the French victim's credibility. Up until Chapter 7, she had deconstructed US Army propaganda in France as a chauvinistic campaign of sexual conquest. Yet once the matter of black rapists arises, she resorts to calling French women dishonest and hysterical with their, quote, fears concerning black men, unquote.
And because he was like, I'm, part of like a certain religion.
Wait, are we being real?
And when the police were basically just like, we can't because of cultural differences, which I don't feel like is such a good.
What? I take it all back, fellas. Don't believe all women, because I don't believe anything about this bitch's story. Choking out like, see, the problem was, my rapist, Muhammad, well, he wasn't white and...
Now, getting back to Roberts' book, she repeatedly highlights in Chapter 7 that many French women were raped in dark places, and uses this fact as a way to call into question their ability to accurately identify their assailants.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
The idea being floated is absurd. Now, on an individual level, she may have a point, but the matter here is racial overrepresentation, and clearly a woman can still discern her rapist's race, even in minimal lighting. If some men, black or white, were wrongly accused by a woman, that is indeed unfortunate. But it is ridiculous to assert that these women consistently misidentified their assailants as black when they were in fact white. She also attempts to attribute black overrepresentation in rape cases to black overrepresentation in service units. As she highlights, quote, 78% of rape accusations against GIs were targeted against troops in service units, where black troops had disproportionate representation, unquote. She argues that service units had more contact with civilians than combat units, and because they were situated in the rear and not on the front, civilians and authorities had more opportunities to report and try cases. She might have a point if it weren't for the fact that almost 40% of American enlisted personnel had rear echelon assignments. And again, blacks were only 10% of US forces. Quite stunningly, Roberts then states that, quote, no evidence exists that comparable problems plagued the Canadian or British troops. The US Army alone appeared to be out of control, unquote. Roberts never stops and considers that Canada had very few black soldiers at the time, and Britain specifically didn't employ colored units from the Empire in Europe, ironically out of concern that something like this might happen. Perhaps the most egregious thing Roberts does in her book is that she insinuates that white soldiers actually blamed black troops for rapes they themselves committed. Quote, aware that black men suffered from a credibility problem with white officers, white soldiers framed blacks for crimes the latter did not commit, either to escape guilt themselves or out of pure racial hatred.
Y'all killing us!
She also states that, quote, white soldiers could rape a French white woman with impunity if an African American was in the vicinity and could be plausibly blamed, unquote. Now, to be fair, I do think Roberts makes a decent case that perhaps in one instance, it was possible that a French woman may have falsely accused a black man to hide the fact that she was cheating on her husband with him. In another case, a local prostitute may have falsely accused black servicemen after she attempted to increase her fees and they refused. Indeed, in this latter case, the authorities dropped the charges after the prostitute's neighbor testified that she was an irresponsible and habitual drunk. Rather than grant the justice system any credit here, however, Roberts instead focused on the idea that, had the neighbor remained silent, the black men could have been convicted. She also states that French prostitutes, quote, were known to threaten black soldiers with charges of rape in order to extort higher fees for services, unquote. In support of this claim, she states in her bibliography that, quote, extortion could explain what happened in Le Havre some months later, when a prostitute was allegedly assaulted in her home by a black soldier who wanted to have sexual relations with her. When a fight broke out between them, the soldier shot her and fled, unquote. I'm going to give you all a minute to let that sink in. Okay. I'm not sure why Roberts cites this, since it seems to support the idea that blacks indeed have low impulse control and a propensity toward violence. It also offers a much better explanation of what had actually happened to the other prostitute Roberts highlighted earlier as having lied about being raped. That prostitute claimed to have been gang raped by 4 black soldiers. In her testimony, she appears to actually admit to being a prostitute, stating that she indeed had sex with them all. But then she states afterwards that they wanted another round. Now, what likely happened here is that she was tired and said no, and they just simply raped her. So perhaps the case would have looked quite different if the neighbor had not testified. But more importantly, none of this supports the idea that white men were successfully raping white women and actively framing black men for it. That sort of cartoonishly evil act would require that local French women knowingly lie about who actually raped them. And Roberts offers no real motive or reason as to why they would do that. What she does do is cite a Jewish author, Studs Terkel, who in turn cited a black GI in Britain who claimed that 16-year-old British girls who had sex with black GIs were encouraged to claim they were raped. Indeed, black GIs back in Britain were also overrepresented in rape convictions. Now, curiously, I think what Roberts is doing here is suggesting that white men took advantage of the impressionability of young teenage girls and coerced them to lie about being raped. But since we're talking about the impressionability of young teenage girls, is it not possible that many of these young teenage girls, some of whom were as young as 14, were coerced into having sex when they didn't want to, as some accounts suggest? But let's simply grant Roberts that all of these young teenage girls in England willingly had sex with black men and were later coerced into claiming they were raped. Does this reveal that adult women in France were living in such fear of white men that they would lie and claim a black man raped them when they knew their rapist was white? Of course, we should note here that Roberts does vacillate between the ideas that white women were just racist and the idea that they were coerced into lying. Again, she highlights all throughout her chapter that most of these women in France were raped in the dark and thus unable to identify their individual assailant, yet, nevertheless, they resorted to using, quote, racist stereotypes such as, quote, speech, large lips, and shiny skins to narrow down the suspects. Roberts also engages hereafter in the trope that white men were just jealous, though if you recall elsewhere in the chapter she had referred to French women as dishonest and hysterical with their fears concerning black men. Her rationale thus seems to be that French women, hysterically terrified of blacks, nevertheless sexually preferred them over jealous white rapists, with whom they later colluded to frame blacks for rapes they didn't commit. What seems more plausible here is that black men simply raped more women than white men did. Now perhaps there were a few instances in which they were wrongly accused, but in France, out of 152 total rape accusations, 139 of the accused were black. Because they made up only 10% of US forces, this is an 826% increase above the 15 accusations we would expect. Now, maybe some of what Roberts has brought up can account for some of the overrepresentation, but nothing she said is going to take us from 139 to 15. What we have here, in my opinion, is an intelligent but liberal-minded white woman who began all of her work with the religious-like assumption that black men simply cannot possibly commit more violent crime than whites, and if such appears to be the case, it has to be the fault of white men and women. So, in case anyone forgot here, this video did begin 2 hours ago as an analysis of the game Call of Duty Vanguard. Now, I do intend on finishing, but I will have to remain brief from here on out in the interest of time. So, after Arthur Kingsley shames the Rhinish German from Neustadt, he and his teammates are transported to a base where another slightly effeminate Nazi expresses shock and fascination when Kingsley tells him he's the team's commander.
I'm the commanding officer. You'll speak with me.
Webb's face conveys here the pure ecstasy he feels in this moment, being able to virtue signal anachronistic values decades removed from his time period. But sadly, no amount of this virtue signaling will convince the foreigners in Britain. This only seems to please self-loathing white people.
In all my years studying the Allies, I have never come across such an unusual unit.
Maybe Nazi Mary Brandybuck is trying to tell us here that the historicity of this unit is highly dubious.
Kingsley.
That's right!
Arthur. Lieutenant, service number 25232642.
Tell you a story. I have spoken with the Führer on exactly one occasion. He recommended a book to me, The Passing of the Great Race, by an American, a man named Madison Grant. The Führer had nothing but praise for him.
Fuck Madison Grant. Fuck Madison Grant.
The book reveals that
The book reveals its dark secrets.
under extreme duress or unfavorable conditions, your people do not deteriorate so easily.
The Nazi is very evil for attempting to validate the racist belief that blacks feel less pain than whites. But look at how strong and robust the black man is compared to the weak, effeminate Nazi.
I knew what I had to do. Right at the suprasternal notch, below the clavicle. Once we had what we needed from this racist bastard.
Because the absolute worst thing you can do in your entire life is be a racist!
That's where I would put my knife.
Now, what I think Activision is doing here is warping Madison Grant's notion that African phenotypes remain dominant physiological features when miscegenation occurs. The idea is that when racial mixing takes place, African characteristics don't deteriorate so easily. Grant didn't harbor in his work some secret fetish, acknowledgement, or fear of black superiority, which is clearly what Activision is trying to convey with their bizarre caricatures.
This Allied team is fascinating.
Now, perhaps Activision erroneously inferred this idea from Grant's book when he discussed how Nordic peoples are not well suited to equatorial climates, that we suffer, quote, deleterious effects of residence outside the natural habitat of the Nordic race, unquote. As he states further, quote, the survival of the fittest means the survival of the type best adapted to existing conditions of environment, unquote. But perhaps this should have been a clue that Madison Grant wasn't exactly some evil genocidal maniac, but rather a thoughtful, intelligent, and considerate person who dealt with reality rather than wishful thinking. Sadly, I don't think we have the time to go into any real depth about what Madison Grant did or didn't say in his book, but do consider here that Madison Grant was from the same uber-racist Jim Crow segregationist America that Hitler praised. That is, the same America in Call of Duty Vanguard that sent one of their top ace pilots with a Hispanic sidekick on a secret mission led by a black man to stop the Fourth Reich. It's amusing, in a sort of depressing, macabre way, that Madison Grant's prediction has essentially come true. That an America that disregarded race would invariably become a fragmented, corrupted caricature of itself.
As Langston Hughes wrote, "Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet, but yet must be the land where everyone is free." Oh, yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be.
The next segment takes us on a flashback journey to the Battle of Stalingrad, wherein we learn about how Lady Nightingale went from army nurse volunteer to deadly super sniper. Again though, Pavlichenko wasn't even at the Battle of Stalingrad. But we're short on time, so let's just say what stands out to me here is how the game vilifies Germans for bombing a Russian hospital. Now, don't get me wrong, that is horrific, assuming the Germans did purposely bomb a Russian hospital. But recall here that in the 2019 reboot of Call of Duty Modern Warfare, it's the Russians who are depicted as war criminals, as they go around shooting and gassing civilians in not Syria. But in any case, Sniper Wolf then runs across the rooftops of Stalingrad with her Assassin's Creed climbing skills, all the while killing hordes and hordes of Nazis who are abusing civilians. She arrives back home in time to see the Germans murder her father in cold blood. This prompts her to go on a rampage, after which she rescues a dozen or so of her male Russian comrades, who grovel and concede that she's the better soldier. This is amusing because then we flash forward to her being interrogated by Nazi Mary Brandybuck, who proceeds to elicit disgust reactions from the audience by beating on her. Then she is returned to her cell, along with the other Allied heroes, where they discuss their plans to outsmart the Nazis. which is a little bizarre because in reality, these prisoners likely would have been split up precisely so that they could not make plans to outsmart the Nazis. Following that scene, we then flash back to our American pilot's past at the Battle of Midway, where he has a token Hispanic sidekick, or co-pilot rather. Now, I am not claiming here that no Hispanics fought for America during World War II. Some did, but America at the time was at least 85% white, and most of the non-white population was black. So really, what are the chances that our ace pilot hero was going to just so happen to have a Hispanic co-pilot who constantly code switched?
Manos a la masa, a lady awaits!
So after this sequence, there's another flashback, this time to the Bougainville campaign in 1943, where our white American pilot and his Hispanic sidekick get shot down and just so happen to come across the black 93rd Infantry Division, who somehow are alone on the island before March of 1944 when they were actually deployed there and attached to the white 23rd Infantry Division, who curiously are absent, along with any of the white officers assigned to the 93rd Colored Unit.
I got control of the stick now, Lieutenant. You're just along for the ride.
Now, yes, the 93rd did serve in a combat role, but again, this was mostly in support for the aforementioned white unit. Of course, Activision has the 93rd basically fighting a guerrilla war behind enemy lines with no support and no white officers. They're practically out there in the jungle winning the entire war for an ungrateful white American public.
You guys said you were 93rd. Never heard of it. Bet you ain't never met a Negro before, neither. We ain't exactly in the credit-getting business.
Now, until the 93rd was actually deployed to Bougainville in 1944, black troops had almost exclusively served in a support role. But black advocates in Washington had been pressuring the government to send black troops into combat. The idea was that if blacks could prove themselves, then race relations would improve. Long story short, the black advocates in Washington got what they wanted, and on April 5th, 1944, K Company was sent out to ambush the Japanese. But a couple of Japanese squads beat them to the punch and ambushed them. In the confusion that followed, many of the black troops began firing in all directions at, quote, imaginary targets, unquote. It was later concluded that many of K Company's 10 killed and 22 wounded were actually self-inflicted casualties by this crossfire. Several soldiers even dropped their packs and fled back to base without orders. At this point, the white commander ordered a retreat. As Captain Crutcher reported later, quote, the men kept moving to the rear, slowly, even though we tried to get them to hold their positions and take up a perimeter defense. They appeared to stand fast until one man moved, and all the men around him would get up and start back. The majority of the men, in moving back, appeared to be careless in their protective measures. Very few retreated with their faces toward the enemy. They would get up and run towards the rear in a crouched position, sometimes catching their jungle packs on hanging vines and being thrown to the ground. I observed 3 or 4 men at one time who came through the undergrowth in this manner. They appeared to have a wild look in their eyes and seemed to focus on everything and nothing at the same time. Some of the men, in coming back, would fall in a prone position and get their rifles in a ready position, but in many instances, their rifles were pointed in many directions, and they did not seem to have a picture in their minds of just where the action and fighting was taking place, unquote. Now, interestingly, this mishap greatly tarnished the 93rd's reputation and convinced many Americans that blacks, indeed, should not be used in combat roles. But many articles I've read about the incident, where I could find them that is, cry racism. So fine, let's concede that these black men did poorly due to racism. Does that grant Activision the liberty to distort the historical record?
The men of the 93rd changed, Wade. They showed the flying daredevil from the clouds what war looked like in the dirt.
So moving on again, after the Bougainville campaign, the game flashes back to Russian super sniper's time at Stalingrad, but we've already talked about this. She dulls a super Nazi sniper and stabs him to death, screaming fascist. Following this, the game flashes back to our Aussies' time during the Tobruk campaign in the North African desert. Again, I'm short on time, so I'll just say that the game dials up the rivalry and animosity felt between Aussies and Brits. The British commander, Hams, is a cowardly and incompetent, but pompous and pretentious buffoon who blames all his failings on the downtrodden Aussie rats of Tobruk.
Mark, is that first rock?
Yes, I know.
That's a tank.
Germans have tanks, Private.
But the armor's too thick. We didn't pack for a tank.
Bloody hell. Hit the treads. It's the only way you're going to stop it.
I need to focus.
No, sir, wait for the treads.
No, wait!
You distracted me.
It was a simple raid, and half the supplies we wanted have gone up in smoke.
Sir, there's still one truck down the ridge.
Well, then take some rats and get after them, Jacobs. Let's go. No good for sniffing around the dirt.
Haven't you heard about the Aussies and the Brits? We were the pieces of shit flushed down the Crown's dunny.
Yes, of course, but your nations are allies.
No, it was more like master-servant. I did what I did because to every Brit, folks like me are expendable.
Okay, so the same British who put a black man in charge of saving their nation also looked down on the Australians as expendable cannon fodder. I suppose they all just needed a black King Arthur to show up and unite them in their war against their German brethren.
Figured you'd want the honors, boss.
No! This is your chance. Project Phoenix! I can get you the evidence!
You've already done your part. Right of the suprasternal notch, below the clavicle.
This scene here is extremely psychopathic. Note the emotionless faces of the cultists as they watch their Black Messiah slowly stab their devil, who is really little more than a reflection of their own European racial awareness. Now yes, this weak, cowardly, slightly effeminate, racist woman beater did do some morally objectionable things, but he is as contrived of a caricature as is Activision's Black King Arthur, whose face here seems to scream, "If you don't see me as your equal superior, I will stab you right of the suprasternal notch below the clavicle." Following this scene, our allies escape the prison, but have to decide whether to flee outright or to hunt down Freisinger, Adolf Hitler's replacement who will bring about the Fourth Reich from the ashes of the Third. Herder. Now, surprise, surprise, the team decides to stay and hunt down the other slightly effeminate Nazi, whom they chase to the airport, surround, and douse with petrol. Now, technically, you can choose not to set him on fire, but then Russian Sniper Wolf will do it for you, because that's what strong, independent women do. Then our heroes board the plane the Nazi villain was going to flee on, only to discover that there are Nazis hidden all over the world in plain sight, hiding right under our noses, because the battle to suppress white racial awareness never ends.
Y'all killing us!
And of course, this egalitarian folly is by no means a greater good. It is a hideous evil. The terror of being called racist paralyzes white people. And if whites will do anything, absolutely anything, to avoid being called racist, the logic is ruthless.